Good morning. Welcome to the public hearing for the inquiry into budget estimates 2021-2022. Before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I'd also like to pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging of the Eora Nation and extend that respect to other Aboriginals present. I welcome President Matthew Mason-Cox and accompanying officials to this hearing. Today, the committee will examine the proposed expenditure for the portfolio of the Legislature. Before we commence, I'd like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. Today's proceedings are being broadcast live from Parliament's website, and a transcript will be placed on the committee's website once it becomes available. In accordance with the broadcasting guidelines, media representatives are reminded that they must take responsibility for what they publish about the committee's proceedings. All witnesses in budget estimates have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time or with certain documents to hand. In these circumstances, witnesses are advised that they can take questions on notice and provide an answer within 21 days. If witnesses wish to hand up documents, they should do so through the committee staff. President, I remind you and the officers accompanying you that you are free to pass notes and refer directly to your advisors seated at the table, well, around you. In terms of the audibility of the hearing today, we have witnesses in person and via video conference. Nope, just committee members via video conference. Can I ask committee members to clearly identify, or really for those online, to clearly identify who questions are directed to, and can I ask everyone appearing remotely to please state their name when they begin speaking? Can everyone please mute their microphones when they're not speaking? Finally, can everyone be reminded to turn your phones to silent for the duration of the hearing. All witnesses will be sworn prior to giving evidence. President Mason-Cox, I remind you that you do not need to be sworn as you've already sworn an oath to your office as a Member of Parliament. For all of the other witnesses, I ask that you each in turn state your full name, position, title and agency, and then swear either an oath or affirmation. The words of both the oath and the affirmation are on the cards on the table in front of you. I'll start with you, Mr Blunt.
David Michael Blunt, Clerk of the Parliaments and Clerk of the Legislative Council. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you, Mr Webb.
Mark Allen Webb, Chief Executive of the Department of Parliamentary Services. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Today's hearing will be conducted from 9:30am to 12:45pm with the President and departmental witnesses, with questions from the opposition and crossbench members only. If required, an additional 15 minutes is allocated at the end of the session for government questions. As there's no provision for a witness to make any opening statement before the committee commences questioning, we will begin questions from the opposition. Mr Buttigieg.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, President, Mr Blunt and Mr Webb for appearing. I will preface it by saying, Mr President, we understand that you're relatively new to the position, so feel free for anyone to jump in and answer any of these questions. But I do want to go to some matters which were raised during the last round, particularly with regards to staff regrading and positions. There was an issue raised about the relativity of members' staff and perhaps looking at regrading them in accordance with the clerical award. Now, my understanding was that there wasn't any action on that up until very relatively recently. I understand there were letters exchanged on Monday. Can you explain to us why it's taken so long for that review to be looked into?
By all means, and it's been less than 6 months, but it's been one hell of a ride, let me tell you, as we all know, particularly through COVID. But in terms of this item coming out from the last estimates, as you alluded, it's something that, if you like, was in the system but hadn't been addressed because of all the other factors that had intervened, particularly the COVID situation. But I became aware of it, and as soon as I did, I asked the Chief Executive Officer to initiate an urgent review. And the letters only went out recently, but that process is in hand. And in that regard, I'm looking forward to setting up a consultation group amongst LC members, including hopefully a minister and indeed a range of members from both the government, opposition and the crossbench to ensure we have a very, very good feel for what the SRAs are doing in each of the offices and are able to filter through what the appropriate work levels are, and in that sense have a full review of that work program. And in that regard, an independent assessment of that as well is part of the review process.
Okay, thanks, President. I might just take you to that then, because the letter that you, I think it was from Mr Wheeler on Monday, advising that the review would be undertaken. There's a degree of ambiguity which concerns me in respect of the working group, which you just touched on. Could you just outline to us that working group doesn't appear to involve staff members directly, which I think is probably defective? Would you be able to give us your views on that? I mean, my understanding is that from the letter, the working group will only involve members. Is there a proposition that the staff members will be involved as well, given they're the subject matter of the review?
Absolutely, and that there'll be also consultation with the unions as part of this. So the process will go through to ensure that we've got the views from staff, the views from members across the broad range of parties and the crossbench, to ensure that we've got a very good assessment of the working arrangements in offices from each of those perspectives, and then with an independent review in the process as well to assess that, if you like, work definition, and be able to make an independent assessment of that so that we can then bring that back for further consultation before finalising that review and understanding what the needs are, what we need to do to change things, if indeed we need to change things.
Okay, so just to clarify, the working group will include staff representatives as well, staff members as well?
The working group itself, with members, won't include staff representatives, but will have a separate process which involves consultation with staff representatives and their union representatives. But I might ask the Chief Executive Officer to comment specifically on that part of it in more detail.
Happy to. And the communication that you're referring to, Mr Buddigee, was a draft proposal for how we'd go about consultation that we put to the PSA earlier this week to test whether we were getting all of the right, hitting all the right buttons when it came to consultation. So the intent is to consult with the groups that the President has outlined. There will be separate consultation with each of the affected groups, but also opportunities to bring that information together. So we will be consulting separately with staff so they can give their opinions and their thoughts independently, but also we will be bringing together at points in the consultation members and staff so that there can be a discussion on what, in particular, in order to reassess the grading and the salary, we need to understand the position description, if you'd like to call it that. What are the duties of the SRA? To what extent do they go through? And that means consultation with absolutely everybody involved.
Okay. And can I ask you, this firm, Mercer Cole and Egan Dell, they're the consultancy company that's been chosen to do the evaluation. How were they chosen?
Okay. I think at the last budget estimates you indicated that you wanted alignment with public sector clerical grades. The Mercer methodology is what the public sector uses to evaluate positions there. So we chose them, directly sourced them on the basis of providing that connection to the public sector as requested.
And they'll be specifically tasked with measuring work value vis-a-vis remuneration?
Yes,
yeah,
that's
okay.
right. So once the members, staff, everyone's been consulted to put together the position description, what is it that the job does, they will then independently assess that position description to say, well, what should the remuneration be for this kind of work?
And President, in terms of the alignment with obviously this is an issue which spills over into the LA as well, and notwithstanding the whole comedy between the houses and all the rest, which is something I'd like to pursue down the track. Have you had a dialogue with the Speaker as to alignment with the lower house and conducting a similar review down there?
Look, I understand the Speaker is interested in looking at the outcomes of this review, and obviously there are natural ties between the electorate office positions and the SRAs. But in that regard, I'm restricted by issues of comity in terms of giving any further details. But I think it's safe to say that the Speaker will be looking with a great deal of interest at what's happening in this area. And indeed, it is something that when you look at the whole industrial framework for the Parliament, it's something that needs to be reviewed in that context as well. And it's interesting because, just as an aside, briefly, this is a summary of Parliamentary's industrial framework, which just shows you just how complex and indeed in some places archaic it is. But in this regard, there is a need for a review, and I think that's widely acknowledged, and I think the actual process that's been put in place, I think, will give us a good outcome.
Can I ask you, just on a related point, President, do you find it strange that there's no jurisdictional recourse for staff members in the event of an industrial dispute? I mean, it's somewhat out of alignment with the rest of the country, I would have thought.
As I said, the industrial framework itself is extraordinary, but it comes as a result of the fact that Parliament and its employment of officers, and indeed across the board under section, I think it's 47B of the Constitution Act, is such that it requires emanating from delegation and the production of awards over time, which really haven't been in detail reviewed, and so, in fact, you look at, for example, the Hansard Award. That's been, I think, recently in the Industrial Relations Commission referred to as not fit for purpose. But all these things have been going on in a band-aid sort of way for some time, and because it emanates from the constitutional provisions, we aren't subject to the same, if you like, government sector employment arrangements that we find in the wider public sector, although we do seek to duplicate those through the awards process here internally in Parliament. I'm happy to pass to...
Can I? No, that's okay. Can I? Because I just want to try and get through as much as I can in the limited time we've got. Can I just take you to the review again? So that one of the issues we want to pursue, perhaps in another bracket of questioning, but I'll raise it here now, is the compensation for additional hours worked, which is covered allegedly by the all incidents allowance. So will this review form part of that as well?
Yes, that's correct. We'll look at all conditions of employment, including whether the all incidents allowance is an appropriate way of compensating for the strange work hours that member staff go through. So,
yeah. And can I ask you, have you got any plans afoot to try and ascertain the amount of hours being worked so that the review is informed by hard data?
Yeah, that will be part of the consultation process, is to try and gather that. One of the issues that staff have raised with us through the Joint Consultative Committee process is that there can be a wide variety. Different people, different members operate their offices differently, different staff work different hours. So we want to make sure we're canvassing, as you say, a wide range of consultation on that regard, so that we can gather hard data to inform what the new arrangements could be.
So when that all incidents allowance was struck originally back in the day, it was to compensate for about 3 hours of additional work per week. My understanding is that wasn't based on any objective analysis. It was just a kind of this is what we reckon, 3 hours is enough. Do you think that, I mean, would it be fair to say here on the record that is woefully inadequate given what our staff are experiencing in terms of additional hours worked?
Yep. I think when that was originally set, I'm not sure that it was set on the basis of any particular hours. What we want to do through this consultation is get some facts on the table, some data, some facts, so that we can look at what the new arrangements should be. You're quite right in saying that the general compensation for member staff was set so long ago that the reasoning behind it was even the base salary amount is lost to the mists of time. We cannot find any records that underpin how that figure was originally arrived at. And for those that were here in 2014, you'll know that one of the things as part of the introduction of the Members of Parliament Staff Act was that the salaries were explicitly left out of the discussions of the introduction of that Act. So it's not just since 2014. The original salaries were set many, many, many years ago, and we don't have any records of how they were struck.
Are you aware of the PSA's apparently done some research into this, and their calculation is that it's about an additional 9 hours per non-sitting week and 10 hours per sitting week, is what their sort of members are telling them? Is that, are you aware of that?
Yes, and one of the reasons, well, of course, we would always consult with the unions as a part of any re-look at things, but we want that perspective brought into these discussions so we have the data necessary to make informed judgments.
Can I ask, is there a timeline for when that research or survey will commence?
We're starting the consultation process in November. The intent is to do it relatively quickly, but we will extend it if we need longer. We want to make sure we've canvassed the opinions of as many people as want to give it to us. So I haven't set a specific deadline to finish the consultation, but we will start it in November.
It seems to me that's a critical piece, right? You've got to get the data to inform the...
That's exactly right.
I just want to take you to the fatigue, the parliamentary fatigue policy. My understanding is that the staff weren't included in the application of that policy. Is that right?
So the SMG, so the two clerks and myself, have been working on a fatigue management policy for a while. We made the call, we got to the point where we had something that covered parliamentary staff, and we made the call, rather than wait for the consultation around members' staff, we made the call to immediately apply it to parliamentary staff, with the intention of then doing the further work to extend it through to members' staff. But we wanted to go through, as part of this work, a consultation about fatigue management as well, because it is bound up with compensation, it's bound up with all the kind of things that we'll be looking at in this review. But we felt that we had a work health and safety obligation to immediately apply it to the parliamentary staff, because we didn't have to go through that further consultation in order to do that.
Yeah, because I think Anthony's going to pursue some issues with regards to that, but I mean, there's all sorts of issues surrounding members' liability in the event of workplace health and safety fatigue. So it's something we need. So there's an undertaking they'll be included.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I just want to wind up my bracket by asking you the sessional staff, that is the staff that support the sittings of the Parliament. Can you outline to the committee what they receive by way of compensation for the additional hours that they work?
You want me to do because it's not really covering DPS staff.
I can start, Mr. Buttigieg. So David Blunt, Clerk of the Parliament for Hansard. So there are, I think, 53 full-time equivalent staff in the Department of the Legislative Council. Approximately 20 are classified as sessional, and they are the staff who are required to be here 2 nights or more after 8 o'clock regularly in sitting weeks. There is, on those evenings when we work back after 8 o'clock, there is an allowance payable. Hopefully one of the staff can send me a message with the exact dollar figure. I probably should know what it is, being a recipient of it. And there's also an additional 2 weeks of recreation leave each year.
So the trigger point for that, Mr. Blunt, is working past 8, is it?
8 o'clock on a sitting day.
All right. Well, if we could have that on notice, that would be good. I'm done, Chair. Have we got any opposition time left? Or?
Yeah, there's still about 3 minutes. Sorry, I've got the clock. Yep, about 3 minutes.
Anthony, did you want to...
Jump in? Yeah, I'll jump in there. Anthony Diadam, for the benefit of Hansard. I just wanted to pick up on where Mark was going around the additional hours. So one of the concerns that I have is the issue around who is actually responsible for the work health and safety of the staff of the members. I think, I'd like to get some clarity about the PCBU when it comes to LC member staff. Can someone perhaps provide some clarity?
Look, before I ask Mark to provide a bit more detail, indeed, this has been an issue that members consistently ask about, and obviously members employ their staff, but the way the occupational health and safety responsibilities work is that basically the members and the Parliament are jointly responsible. Obviously, Parliament provides a working place and has responsibilities in that regard, and obviously members provide directions and the like within their office, so have responsibilities in that regard, and indeed that work environment is critically important to every staff member. So I think it's a joint responsibility in that sense, and it's important that obviously in an environment where Parliament itself, indeed our House, determines the work environment and the length of hours, we as members have a collective role, if you like, to ensure that that workplace is sensitive to occupational health and safety issues as well. And just recently in the procedure subcommittee I put on the table the issue of length of working hours and the need to reflect upon that in the context of reviewing our standing and sessional orders and the times in which the House is destined to sit as a result of the will of the House. And that's an important consideration because whether we like to reflect upon it or not, but the danger is often when a person is leaving the place to go home late at night, and there have been some incidents of near misses for members and staff, and they are a great concern to me personally as presiding officer, and it's something I think we really need to reflect upon as a House and as well as individually as members. But I might just ask the Chief Executive Officer to add any further comments.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Diadam. After the last budget estimates session, we did seek some advice around the PCBU definition for a Parliament. In summary, it came back that there are joint responsibilities between the Parliament as an institution and members for the work health and safety, and depending on of staff, and depending on the circumstances, either or both could be considered the PCBU. So, for instance, the Parliament, if we were not providing some facility or not providing some piece of equipment or something along those lines that assisted in things like fatigue management, then the responsibility would be with us. But if a member was directing what a judge might consider unreasonable working conditions, then they would judge the member to be the PCBU under those circumstances.
Can I just go to that particular
Sorry,
point?
Mr. Diadam, it's crossbench time. Who's up? Mr. Latham?
I'll just ask a quick question. There's just to follow through from directed to the President, please. There's been significant amounts of capital works done on through the last President's presidency, and now it continues under you. Would you like to give us an update and a bit of an overview of what's going on? There's works going on, for example, in the foyer. There's works going on various floors. I note, for example, when I go up to level 12, they don't have the benefit of having new toilets up there like we've got. All that sort of stuff. I mean, can you give us a rundown, please, but maybe start more locally here?
There is a lot that's going on, but there are a number of major projects as well as a whole range of minor capital works. But starting at the top, level 12, there's the works that are going on the membrane, the roof membrane, which is a significant issue. I mean, just as a general comment, being a heritage building, there are obviously real maintenance issues, and sadly the department, as a result of its negotiations with Treasury over many years, has, if you like, not being given the necessary funding to upgrade the building in the manner in which perhaps all members would desire. And look, just as in terms of a ballpark figure, if you look at the funding shortfall, it's something in the order of about $400 million over the last 20 years. So these things...
Sorry, say that again, how many?
It's something like $400 million
$400 million
over the last 20 years. And this relates to how we deal with issues of depreciation and seek to reinvest in the building itself. So if you look, for example, at some of the issues, we have, leaking roof problems, which has been a major upgrade. I think we're up to stage 3 of that upgrade at the moment, and there is a subsequent stage as well, and and that's really to ensure that the roof is structurally sound and not leaking, and indeed that will continue into next year. There are obviously upgrades that have been done to some of the bathrooms, as you mentioned. There's a continual need to upgrade those sort of amenities across the building, and obviously we have restricted funding, so we look to prioritise that appropriately. There's, if you like, the hidden infrastructure of the IT, which is being upgraded through a range of particular projects, from simply upgrading the local internet, which we've doubled the capacity of the internet just in the last 6 months, and indeed to the wholesale IT in each of the chambers, which will be fast-tracked. And first, in fact, the LA is going to have their whole chamber rewired, if you like, for IT over the break, and the LC will follow in due course. You would have seen, for example, in Strangers' dining room and members, that the work that's been done in relation to the ceiling, and indeed in Strangers, that's also in relation to the IT and the audio-visual sort of facilities in that area, which has been long needed. And again, that program will move into level 7, where we're looking to upgrade the fountain court ceiling and all the works related thereto, but that will wait again until the House isn't sitting over a parliamentary sitting break. So there are a range of smaller projects that you might have seen, for example, the improvement in the disabled access through the back gates from Hospital Road, with the ramp up into the building, as well as the ramp in the Speaker's courtyard, which has improved the disabled access around the building. And these are just naturally problems you have with a building of so many years old, which has to be upgraded for those types of occupational health and safety issues, as well as the reinvestment in the actual fabric of the building to ensure that it can continue and maintain and be fit for purpose. So these things are continuing. I could go on ad nauseum, but there's a flavour of it. I'm happy to answer any more specific questions.
What's happening in the foyer with the coffee shop and all that stuff?
The coffee shop, well, that's been an ongoing issue. There's been a consultancy that's worked up some of the options in relation to improving how you find your way through Parliament, because the signage isn't very good. And one of those issues was, well, how do you find the public cafe? Because there's not a lot of signage for it. And prior to my time, the decision was made to actually put in a set of doors from the fountain court into the public cafe, or the members' bar, or the staff bar. It's had a few purposes, and I think it still has a few purposes depending on the time of day. And in that regard, there was a special door ordered from San Francisco, which had the ability to, with the press of a button, go from clear to opaque, so as to provide privacy for members and for people using that facility. And that door was sadly unable to be completed after 4 execution attempts. So that contract was cancelled just recently, and the money in regard to the door that was prescribed under the contract was refunded to the Parliament, I'm pleased to say. And that issue is still a question as to whether we proceed with a door into that area I've actually sought the council of members, the Legislative Council, to understand their concerns, if any, about putting a door there. And indeed, the proposal was to put some chairs and tables in the Fountain Court area. And I've got to say the feedback I've received has been, on the whole, negative in terms of impeding the egress of members to and from the chamber, and indeed disrupting the exhibition space along the walls of the area in the Fountain Court. So there's a range of views here, and I know that members are sensitive to this, so it's an ongoing discussion point between myself and the Speaker. And at this point in time, no final decision's been made, but for the time being, those works have come to a halt.
Thank you. Mr Latham.
Thanks, Chair, and to the President and Mr Blunt and Mr Webb. What was the costing on the frosted door?
I think the costing was the order of $65,000 for the door and the works associated with the door.
That's correct.
And the full cost of the door has now been refunded?
It has.
The status of the project?
I should say of the door component. The works that we did to create the frame for the door had already been done. So that's the door itself was $27,500 of that $63,000.
And this survey of how hard it is to find that cafe area, I mean, it's not the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, is it? It's not the biggest tourist attraction that you're going to find internationally. Are we kidding ourselves to spend this amount of money on the proposition that people can't find that cafe? And if the problem is signage, why don't you put up a few more signs?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to do. In fact, we were discussing it with the PEG just yesterday. So we're sort of looking at just how we would do that to ensure that people are able to easily find their way through the building from actually when they first arrive in the guard room, so to speak, or the entrance, and just there's some confusion about where to go and the like. So look, I think at the end of the day, these things will be sorted by just some practical measures. And
the project's been abandoned and the cost has been saved.
Well, at this point in time, it's still an active matter of discussion, but I certainly have a view in that regard. I'm concerned about the impact on the Fountain Court as one of the premier exhibition spaces in New South Wales, and indeed that was the purpose of that exhibition area. And I'm also concerned about the architectural impact, and indeed the heritage plan for the Parliament points out the need to ensure that the whole Fountain Court is uncluttered and continues to be uncluttered, because that gives the whole space its significance and I think the impact when you do walk into Parliament House. So it's important that we respect those heritage considerations. And as I said, I have a personal view that the project should be abandoned, and I've made that very clear. As to the next steps, that will be discussion with the wider executive group.
Right, and that would be a saving of $65,000 in total, minus the work already undertaken on the door frame.
Yes, that's right.
And if it didn't proceed, we'll just have to simply put back the partitioning that's been removed on the side of the bar itself or the cafe itself, and just puts some of the marbling sort of edging back as well. So that's what would be involved, which we anticipate would be several $1,000s to finalise that, but obviously we'd need to get a final quote on that, and it's all subject to the agreement of the wider executive group.
So that's several $1,000s, and how much was it to make the door frame?
About to do the demolition, remove the services and run the services around it, was about $33,000, I think.
Spent already, that's gone.
Yeah, that's already spent, yeah.
So we're looking at somewhere around south of $40,000 for
Restore it to get it back.
A whole bunch of nothingness. A few signs in the end.
Well, if that's what it ends up being, it'll be around about that figure, unfortunately.
Can I just ask how this is allowed to happen? I mean, people work hard for their taxes. They look at this building and think there'd be some value for money. It's in the eye of the beholder. But how can we be wasting just south of $40,000 on a nincompoop idea that you needed a third entrance to a small cafe area when signage would have been the logical way to go? And isn't this indicative of a big spend in this building, some $236 million per annum in the budget papers, and at the end of every financial year there must be a mad scramble to spend the money, find any old way of spending it, otherwise of course it would be lost?
Well, this project predates my sort of ascension to the role, let me put it that way, and so I can't comment specifically on that. I might ask the Chief Executive Officer to take a comment on that point, but in relation to the budget of the Parliament itself, I mean, the budget has a capital and a sort of ongoing operational categorisation, and the capital is around about $40 million a year. So the reality is that is for what needs to be done to this building, and the heritage issues included, it's actually not sufficient to maintain the building in the manner in which a modern working parliament would expect. And the upgrades that we're doing are really catch-ups, and we're still well behind the eight ball in terms of what we need to do to ensure that we have the sort of services that you'd expect in a modern parliament. It's a challenge and an ongoing challenge.
Well, Mr. President, would it be possible to provide the committee with a list of the capital projects that have been ticked off in the last 3 months of the past 5 financial years as to the timing of these projects?
Yeah, I'd have to take that on notice.
Take that on notice.
So the concern about
a rush
spending
at the
money
end
any old way for the sake of spending it could be addressed by the committee and the broader parliament, because this is something that's suggested around the place, and would be useful to get that information as to the timing of these big capital spends.
By all means, happy to do that.
Thank you. And on this subject of the budget, I did have a look at budget paper number 2, the outcome statement, and for the $236 million per annum, there's actually no listing of outcomes. This is supposed to be an outcomes statement. There are strategic priorities, description of what they mean, and then a big spending list. Why doesn't the legislature actually list outcomes in terms of these 5 strategic goals that you're trying to achieve?
Well, I might just ask the CEO to comment on that, but obviously that's just as a general statement. It's the normal sort of pro forma in relation to the presentation of these documents. But at the end of the day, in terms of specifics, we have a list of projects and a whole sort of range of initiatives that obviously are ongoing, which we can provide some more detail on. But if you'd like to make a comment.
Yeah, absolutely. As members of the committee know, one of the things that we've been pursuing over the last few years is whether the process for funding the Parliament is an appropriate process. It currently is dictated by the executive, what money the Parliament gets or doesn't get. By way of example, and to some of your earlier questions, Mr. Latham, the depreciation of the existing assets here at Parliament is between $15 and $16 million a year. So the wear and tear on the asset base that we have, it goes backwards by $15, $16 million a year. Our only guaranteed capital allocation to offset that is a $2.9 million minor capital works allocation. Everything else, we have to put a business case into the executive and convince the executive that money should be spent. And if you want an example of that, I've had several members recently point out to me that the doors on the elevators that go down to the car park, a couple of them slam shut quite alarmingly at the moment, and we obviously do annual safety reviews of the lifts, but it's been a long time since we've done a complete refurbishment of the elevators because it hasn't been able to get to the top of the list. One of the things that we negotiated with Treasury recently is to say that the outcomes of the executive government are not an appropriate thing to measure the performance of the Parliament against. the Treasury agreed with that, and this year's budget papers show the starting point of us starting to develop our own outcomes framework. It is very early days, but you'll see here that we have identified 5 strategic priorities. We also did some work identifying, making sure that we have a clear articulation of the purpose of the Parliament around the making of law, the scrutiny of the executive and the representation of constituency, and put underneath that some of the key building blocks for a successful Parliament. This is the starting point of us developing our own outcomes-based framework, which reflects the outcomes that the Parliament needs to have, rather than trying to jury or retrofit Parliament into the outcomes that the executive needs to have. When someone asks me which Premier's priority does the Parliament fit into, the answer is none of them, because quite frankly, the Premier's priorities are the priorities of the executive, not the priorities of the Parliament. And so, what you're seeing here today is a great first step towards building an outcomes framework that is a Parliament outcome framework rather than a retrofitted executive outcome framework. But I do acknowledge, Mr. Latham, this is step one, and more work needs to be done.
When do you expect the first report outcomes in this budget document?
We've been doing more work through the course of this year, so I would expect the next budget papers would have the next iteration, which would include some of that outcome information. I don't want to promise you that it'll be a perfect outcome framework. It is something that requires a lot of work, and we have had so many years of trying to retrofit the Parliament into the executive's priorities that it is something we have literally had to start from scratch.
Okay, well, I would have thought a starting point is, surveying staff about their satisfaction in the job, members of Parliament, in how they see the building and their elected role. So I'm not expecting these would be big expenditure items. It's really just to find out how the Parliament itself sees itself performing and report those outcomes to the public that pay this big amount of money every year.
That's a very reasonable suggestion. We've done that on sort of individual items in the past, but what you're reflecting is probably a broader, rather than saying, are you specifically happy with the catering option, we're saying, are you, an overall satisfaction with whether the facilities are there. That is the kind of work that we would like to do.
Okay, thank you. And when was the last time in the expenditure of these budget items, recurrent and capital, there was an underspend at the end of the financial year and the money went back to Treasury?
We've not given any money back to Treasury in the time that I've been here at the Parliament. We have rolled forward if there's timing issues around projects. So, for instance, this last year and this year are good examples. Some of the COVID restrictions that came in meant that we had construction pauses in the last few months. As an example, you might recall that construction work had to drop to 50% capacity on site, and also had to be completely isolated. Work could only proceed if it was completely isolated from the working building, which we're able to do on some projects. It is likely at the end of this year that we will roll money forward into next year to finish those works because of those delays. So we have, each year there are timing issues that result in us rolling money forward, but we've not given money back to the executive.
When you say since you've been here, how long's that?
5.5 years.
So in 5.5 years, there's never any return to Treasury?
No, but there have been...
Spent or rolled over?
Yeah, spent or rolled over.
And the bollards at the front here in Macquarie Street, how much did they cost? It seemed a very extended project. I thought you were redoing the whole sewerage system of Sydney there at one point.
Well,
how much did all of that cost over the 12 months?
I might just look that up, but I would...
Take it on notice.
I'll give it back to you before the end of the session. But I would say your observation is actually probably, I know it was made in jest, but it's probably not far wrong. There were, if you've ever looked at Macquarie Street, the services under Macquarie Street are not as well known to the utilities companies as they probably should be, given it's one of the oldest streets in Sydney. And some of the issues that came up were not a matter of spending, it was a matter of when we started digging things up, they found pipes they didn't know existed, cables they didn't know were there. In fact, one of the things we had to go back to do is redirect a water pipe that was there that nobody knew about. So I know your comment was in jest, but it's actually not far from...
Nobody knew it was so hard to build bollards.
Well, yes, because you have to go quite deep into the ground in order for them to withstand the impact of a vehicle coming through. So
Bollards will outlast us all, that's sure.
I'm hoping that if
Speak
there
for
is...
yourself.
I'm hoping that they will at least outlast me, Mr Latham.
Okay, we'll have to come back to this. Mr. Diadam.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I want to come back to where we left off around this observation that there's a joint responsibility for WHS. I suppose the SRA staff are engaged to support the member in the work, and it's pretty self-evident that the sitting of the Parliament is a primary manifestation of the work of the member. We're routinely sitting late nights, and you know, in most industries, there's a standard 10-hour break between when a worker finishes and when they are then required to return to the workplace. That doesn't obviously exist. I wonder how we're supposed to, as members, manage that issue around fatigue on those sitting nights. There doesn't appear to be any guidance to members. Can perhaps the President or the CEO provide some commentary on how a member is expected to discharge that responsibility?
Look, in that regard, before I pass to both David and Mark, who are keen to address this, let me just reflect on just the Hansard situation, if I may, for a moment, which might be a way of looking at how to deal with this. And indeed, there's a significant amount of work that's gone into the fatigue management policy in this regard, given the special circumstances of Hansard. And there's been put in place at least an 8-hour sort of downtime between leaving work and coming back to work for Hansard, and as well as that maximum of, I think it was 55 hours a week in that regard. And one needs to note as well that Hansard gets double the overtime or incidence allowance as a normal staff member. They get just over $18,000 a year plus extra leave. So there are sort of factors in there to actually ameliorate the impact. But again, it is a serious impact, and it's an impact that is, if you like, in the hands of Parliament to determine its sitting hours. And obviously these consequences flow, and the department has tried to, in all the different circumstances, manage the impact of that on its staff. As for member staff, look, that again is a factor that members need to be cognizant of, and it's within their purview to say to their staff that they should not come back until a certain hour, and to manage that appropriately. If one is looking for guidance, then you know, those are things that certainly one can take advice on from the department, and indeed I think the advice will be pretty clear based on those sorts of parameters I've outlined in relation to the Hansard staff who are in a peculiar situation. But I would obviously encourage members to make those necessary judgments. But in that regard, I might just pass to the CEO and David as well in that.
Before you do, I might just pick up on that particular point, because the implication of that suggestion is that members should send their staff away when the Parliament's actually sitting. It seems, I suppose, just hard to comprehend that we would have a situation where we would be required to attend Parliament unsupported for a period of time, when the purpose of the SRA position is to support the members in their work, and the parliamentary sitting is a primary manifestation of that work. It just seems...
There are things in conflict here, obviously, and you know, I certainly have been in the same position, and I've sent my staff home at sort of like before dinner on nights to ensure that they do have a proper break. These are within the purview of the member to manage their own staff, and those are the working conditions a member must actually make a judgment about. Obviously, the sitting hours of Parliament itself is a matter for the House to determine, and if the implications of that for member staff are such that member staff are staying because the member is asking them to stay, for in some cases perhaps in the almost 36-hour sitting we had in relation to the energy roadmap, then obviously you'd need to make a judgment about when it's appropriate for your staff to actually go home, and how you deal with that in a proper manner under the occupational health and safety responsibilities a member has for his or her staff. So these are judgments that obviously a member must be cognizant of and needs to manage appropriately as the department manages for its own staff.
So can I clarify then? Is it your suggestion that that the liability potentially, let's imagine a situation where a member keeps their staff late on a sitting night, the staff member goes home late, they're injured in the course of returning home. Are you saying that the member has the liability in that situation?
Look, I'm not going to give a pronouncement as a court of law may if there was an incident that might occur, but as we discussed earlier, the Crown Solicitor's advice was that there is a joint responsibility, and where that starts and stops obviously depends on the peculiar circumstances. But in that regard, you have obviously the member's relationship with the staff member and the internal office working arrangements, the need to understand the impact of the circumstances of Parliament sitting late. All these things are self-evident. Obviously, they feed into each other, and that's where the joint responsibility actually, if you like, originates. But as to how and where that stops and starts, that would be clearly a matter that would need to be turned on its own circumstances. But I'd be happy to take some further comments from the Chief Executive Officer in that regard, particularly in relation to the legal aspects of which we have sought some legal advice.
Yes, I think what you said before, Mr. President, is quite right, that it would depend on the particular circumstances and depending on the nature of the incident, what a judge or a coroner might determine in terms of who's liable. So it's very hard to make generalised comments, but the advice generally is that there is a joint liability. So both the Parliament as an institution and individual members do need to be making decisions about fatigue management and other work health and safety practices in the best interests of staff. I know David wanted to say something on the general topic, so before I continue, I've found that my rule of thumb over the years is that always defer to the clerk, so I'll let David say his bit before I add further comment.
Thanks, Mark. Mr. Adam, they're excellent questions you're asking, if I can say so, and they're ones that are of great interest, and that they've been things that we've been doing a lot of work on over recent months. Two things. Firstly, I wanted to draw your attention in relation to the discussion of the legal situation to an excellent report. I know this is not a budget estimates inquiry into the Legislative Assembly, but the thoughtful work of my colleague, the Clerk of the Legislative Assembly, and her staff in relation to the Privileges Committee of the LA in relation to the proposal for a Parliamentary Compliance Officer, paragraphs 1.45 to 1.66 of that report from earlier this year is basically a discussion of legal advice around effectively the joint liability of members and the Parliament in relation to WHS and also in relation to discrimination matters. It's a really important piece of work and one to which I draw the attention of all members. The second point I'd just make is that, yes, like Hansard, we in the Department of the Legislative Council have been doing a lot of work in this area. Of course, the procedural innovations introduced in 2019, as they've rolled through, have made the Legislative Council an even more effective house of review. No doubt the most active and perhaps assertive upper house within Australia, if not within the Commonwealth, I would say. But that has had implications in terms of working hours. There are many weeks when the hard adjournment sort of seems to become almost the default, and we have a midnight or near midnight finish on a Tuesday, and then a midnight, 12:30 a.m. finish on a Wednesday. For the procedure office staff, they've started work at 8 a.m. in the morning to start to get ready for sitting days. Those who are responsible for the business papers, the minutes and the notice paper, etc., are there for an additional half hour or hour after the house rises. So that's a very long day. So we've been actively seeking to manage fatigue by effectively in a sense, a roster arrangement so that half those 20 staff who, coming back to the sessional allowance question before, who support the sittings of the House, approximately half are leaving between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. and they're the 8 a.m., 8:30 a.m. starters the next day. Those who are finishing at 1:30 a.m. I find it difficult to do anything other than encourage them to not be here before 9 o'clock. They're so dedicated and they see their professional duty to sitting, supporting the sittings of the House. But there's certainly that arrangement in place. We're experimenting with that. It seems to be helping a little bit with managing fatigue, but is it a total answer? Frankly, no. Those sitting arrangements are taking a bit of a toll, and so the sort of things that Mr. President spoke about earlier and possible initiatives and things for your consideration as members of the House, you set the sitting hours of the House, so they're matters that I'd really like you all to consider for the health and safety of your staff, of Mark's staff, but also the LC staff.
Is there any capacity to provide some relief for the RSA staff, also the SRA staff? Is there any mechanism that would enable a member to send a staff member home and cover the gap with relief? Available?
So at the moment, the independent tribunal determination sets the staffing levels for SRAs and for members. At the moment, my reading of it wouldn't allow for that, but it could perhaps be, and I would encourage all members, I think the tribunal is currently accepting submissions on the determination. It might be something that you put through. The issue of short-term relief, I did seek and have some authority to provide additional short-term relief arrangements in emergency situations. So, for instance, when a bushfire affects an electorate and an electorate office is overwhelmed as a result, to provide some additional short-term relief there. So the concept of additional relief in extreme circumstances is a concept that has been considered by the tribunal. It might, but I don't think it has been considered specifically in relation to SRAs and the sitting of the House. So I would encourage members to make a submission if that's something that you would like to see more flexibility around as you move forward.
Is this something that the President, these work health and safety issues, is this a matter that the President has made submissions about in relation to the PRT?
Not in relation to the SRAs previously, but certainly the flexibility in the emergency situations was something that was put forward by previous presiding officers.
It is something that we are contemplating, and obviously the submission to the Remuneration Tribunal is something we'll probably put in the next, probably weeks. And I have a submission in front of me that I'm considering at the moment in that regard. And so, look, all those things are actively under consideration.
You also...
From that,
Sorry, Mr. Dadham, you asked earlier about advice around for members around fatigue management. I just wanted to make sure we close the loop on that question. While there isn't specific advice for members at the moment, I would draw your attention to the fatigue management policy that was recently published for parliamentary staff. A lot of the principles and techniques in that policy would be applicable to members' staff. As I said earlier, we intend to go through a consultation process to make sure we take into account the very specific nature of members' staff work, but there is some good general advice in that policy that's well worth having a look at if you're interested in seeking advice. And I should also point out that the Work Health and Safety team, my very excellent Work Health and Safety team, is available to provide specific advice to members, and I know they have provided specific advice to members who have particular circumstances that they want to work through, because I know you all run your offices generally. And finally, on that point, I did want to just to echo some of the comments that David made. I did want to point out the excellent work that the Hansard team do. They are equally dedicated to the operation of the Parliament. Yeah, and they're often here 3 hours after the sitting of the House to make sure the transcripts get out. So
forget what was said.
Yeah, that can be, I think, inaudible, and some other words are sometimes used. But it is an area that we are actively looking at as well. Sorry, Mr. Dadham.
That's right. I wanted to just pivot on this point around the work health and safety liability and ask, who is responsible for the work health and safety of members? Who is the PCBU for members?
That is an excellent question, Mr. Dadham. You are not employees of the Parliament, so the Parliament as an institution is not the PCBU when it comes to members. The best analogy that I've been given is that it is like we have 135 small business owners in the context of the Parliament, and that you have, to a certain extent, responsibility for yourselves in that regard. In particular, some of the provisions under the things like the Parliamentary Precincts Act, for instance, which allow you to act as it should with freedom of movement in the precinct and the like, means that the institution has limited ability to affect the safety conditions for you. Having said that, if there was an incident with a member and a judge or a coroner was involved, that judge or coroner may determine that if the Parliament if there was a step we could have taken that we hadn't taken, they may draw us in to that, but it is not as clear-cut with members as it is with other staff. So it is an excellent question that I don't have a definitive answer on, but that's where the thinking is at the moment.
Okay, I might move on. Can I ask about the question of the Hansard facilities? Obviously, we've had a burgeoning number of committee inquiries. It's putting pressure on the Hansard. What measures are being taken to try and meet the increasing demand that's being placed on Hansard?
I might ask Mark to pick that up.
Thank you. That's another excellent question, and I appreciate it being asked. You're quite right. There's two things that have been driving work in Hansard. One, probably three actually. One is around the fatigue management that we've covered generally. The second is a significant increase in activity. If the House isn't sitting, there's usually at least one committee inquiry going on. So the days when Hansard would have peaks and then troughs where they could recover are pretty much gone. And the third is we are keeping an eye around the world on what's happening with technology in Hansard and the like. There's some interesting stuff happening over in the UK, for instance, but we don't have any advanced plans to introduce any of it here, but we are watching and learning from our colleagues in other jurisdictions. In the last couple of years, we have... Sorry, Mr. Dadham.
On that technological issue, I just wanted to ask about closed captioning.
Yes.
And whether that's under consideration and what impact that might have on Hansard
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yes, closed captioning is under consideration. We have gone to market and are assessing tenders from the market around closed captioning service for both the sittings of the House and for committee inquiries. The output from that closed captioning will be available to Hansard to help with the transcription process. It does in no way replaces the work of Hansard, but it gives them another stream of information that may help to speed up the process in certain areas. But we would expect to be...
that won't impact the staff numbers, the closed captioning?
No, not the... Yeah, no, not what we've got in place at the moment. Of course, we're hoping that it will provide a benefit to the staff in terms of having something more advanced to start with in terms of transcription. But of course, until we actually see it in operation, we won't be able to judge whether that's the case or not. The primary reason for closed captioning is, of course, to extend the reach of parliamentary proceedings to people that are hard of hearing. But we are hoping it will provide an advantage. I should also say we have increased by 50% the number of Hansard staff as a result of these increases in workload. So a few years ago there were 20, 21, 22, I can look up the exact number, but in the early 20s Hansard staff, there are now over 30 Hansard staff. The fatigue management that we've been talking about... Sorry?
Are they permanent? What's the ratio in terms of...
most of the new staff are temporary positions because we only got temporary money, but we have been successful in seeking that to be extended to the end of the parliamentary term rather than on a year-to-year basis. So that's given more certainty to people in the team. And of course, we continue to make submissions to Treasury based on, unless the membership here wants to tell me that you're going to be doing less committee work into the future, our argument to Treasury is that these increases in committee work are not temporary measures, they are permanent increases, and so we are trying to seek that money to be converted into permanent money so that we can make permanent offers to people.
It's also worth noting that not only is the committee work more than doubled in this term of Parliament, but the hours that the House is sitting is averaging about 11 hours over the course of the sitting. And that compares to around about 7.75 in the previous term of Parliament. So we've increased the number of hours significantly, no doubt aided and abetted by the long 36-hour sitting in relation to the energy roadmap, but there are significantly increased hours and there are significantly increased committee work as well. So we're very cognizant of the impact on the Hansard staff, and indeed the increasing staffing has been welcome. But it looks like that Treasury item will continue to be put up on a regular basis because we simply need to ensure the Parliament is appropriately resourced for these essential tasks. Can I just say the work they do is amazing, and we are very, very fortunate to have such committed professionals that support us.
Thanks. Crossbench, Mr Shibridge.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just say on behalf of my party, the Greens, to just commend you and thank you and all the team, your team, Mark, your team, David, the work of your office too, Mr President. It's been an extraordinary 18 months, and the professionalism and the diligence of everybody, all your teams, is recognised and appreciated by my party. So thank you very much. Perhaps to you, first of all, Mr Blunt, the amount of work coming for your team on SO52s must be difficult to manage, but it must also be difficult to manage because we don't have a cooperative arrangement with the government on how that information is passed through to the House. Can you let us know if there are any ongoing negotiations to make that a smoother flow of information?
Can I just come in there just quickly, because there is something that you won't be aware of, and that occurred at the subcommittee meeting for the Procedure Committee just last week, and that is this was an active issue, obviously in relation to the review of sessional orders and standing orders. And one of the outcomes suggested is that the President look at developing a practice guideline to actually start to look at how we smooth that transition, because obviously we've got the issues from the Legislative Council's end in terms of how we get an effective concise Standing Order 52 that targets the information that members want without creating resource issues for the government that are probably outside the scope of what the member's really looking for. So having a more of a consultative front-end sort of process, as well as then the information provided by government, ensuring that we don't end up with all these privileges claims that are coming through, which tend to hold the process up. So there's two sides of this equation, and trying to make that work effectively and ensure that we do end up with the necessary guidelines within government that are, if you like, within what the House is looking for, and facilitating that process indeed with the electronic transmission of returns in time as well. So with those few comments, just as an introductory measure, I might just ask David to talk about the specifics.
Mr Shoebridge, you're absolutely correct. The number of Standing Order 52 orders for papers has increased significantly. So as at the end of June this year, so effectively in the first 2 years of this parliamentary term, there were 254 orders for the production of documents. The previous largest number was in the 53rd Parliament, 2003 to 2006, 145 over 4 years. So it's this Parliament has seen really a very significant increase. There is an exciting project underway, and it is there is a significant degree of cooperation and collaboration from our colleagues in the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and I really do want to commend them for their participation as partners in this. So the LC Procedure Office staff has been working with Mark's team, the digital transformation team, and DPC on the development of an e-return system. It's being developed to provide the Parliament and government agencies with an electronic system for the lodgement and receipt of returns to order, so that documents will be able to be transferred to Parliament through a new parliamentary portal that links to the Parliament's existing storage databases. And of course, storage and accurate record keeping in this space is absolutely vital, as is information security. It's anticipated that an e-return system will improve the accessibility of returns to order and provide significant administrative efficiencies for us here at Parliament, but also for the government, for government agencies, while ensuring file security and appropriate document oversight is maintained. I can provide further details on notice if you like, or I can table the written material that's been provided by the team. In terms of where to from here though, I understand that we should have a platform ready to go out to consult with members to show you something during the first half of next year, and for DPC to be able to go out to agencies and consult with them. I do have to emphasise, though, that not only is this a really complex and challenging IT systems development task, and the work of Mark's team and the consultants who are working with us has been absolutely fabulous. Ultimately, though, there will be two sets of political decision-making that are required for this to be implemented. Number one would be from the House. The House would need to agree to a sessional order to facilitate e-returns. But secondly, there will need to be a political decision within government to support the rollout of the system on which DPC are cooperating with us on its development.
I'm assuming this is not without cost. There must at least be some indication from the government that they're willing to go down this path for us to be engaging in it.
At an officer level, there is, as I say, there's been a really cooperative and collaborative working relationship. But of course, the officers that we're working with within the executive just as aware of we are that there are those two sets of political decision making that are required.
Is it envisaged that when the system is up and if that system gets up and running, it would be online searchable databases?
That's my understanding, yes.
Has it ever been explained to you the mystery of the current indexing system used by the Department of Premier and Cabinet, which seems almost designed to obfuscate rather than to assist?
Unusual. Indeed. Unexpected.
Has it ever, I mean,
If I can start by saying this, the provision of indexes is critical to enabling the system of orders for papers to work. And so back 20 years ago, post the Egan decisions, that was a significant achievement for the House to have the executive produce indexes, because that's a new document that's produced on top of documents already in existence. And so I don't think it should be underestimated the impact and assistance of having indexes. DPC provide a really valuable role, and we really came to appreciate this in a number of instances where there were orders for production of documents from independent statutory bodies that aren't subject to ministerial direction or control, and we received significant returns directly from those statutory bodies without the added value that DPC play. And so I think it would be unfair to be reflecting adversely on the role of DPC. We certainly appreciate it from the Department of the
I think any index is better than no index, but I, for the life of me, cannot work out the rationale upon which the index is created. Has it ever been explained to you that there is a rationale on which the indexes are?
Other than from time to time the legibility of indexes, when sometimes the font has been small, when there have been very significant returns received, the criticism of the quality of indexes has not been high on the list of the many issues that members have raised in relation to
They just seem to not be in rational categories. You know, it reminds me of that sort of Foucault list, you know, of an encyclopedia in China, you know, animals that from a long distance off look like ants, animals that are owned by the emperor, those that recently broke the water pitcher. That seems to be the kind of categories we get from DPC.
I think I probably should take that as a comment.
I think your point's made.
All right.
The best documents are near the back.
Actually, in the middle is that's where you look. In the middle, in between 1,000
Basically, least likely to look with patience.
Blank emails. Could I ask about the catering? It might be to you, Mr. Webb. This will surprise you. The Greens believe that there should be a greater availability of vegan and gluten-free options in the cafe, given that, you know, vegan food is basically able to be eaten by anybody. What are the arrangements in place to ensure that we've got more vegan and gluten-free food?
Are you okay with me? Yeah.
Much more than it used to be. Used to be.
No, I accept that.
Yes. So we are very aware of the fact that we have a wide range of consumers of our catering offerings, including people that want vegan, vegetarian, gluten-free options, and so we always do make sure that there are those options available. We look at, in terms of the range that's available, one of the things we look at is demand. So if we put additional items on, do people buy those additional items, to try and find a balance, because there are, you'll be unsurprised to hear, Mr. Shoebridge, there are some people that would prefer a steak and some potatoes. There are a wide range of options.
They can be catered for.
They can be. So we do, but we take very seriously issues of things like food waste and the like. We try to make sure that we don't end up with a huge amount of food waste. So a lot of our the range is based on demand, essentially. So where we have put additional vegan and other options, do people actually buy them? Is the rationale, to be honest.
All right. Well, it's a bit of, build it and they will come, I would have thought.
And we do, as you know, we change the menu each week in Cafe Quorum, and there have been weeks where we have put additional vegan and vegetarian options on as well. But we find that, look, I don't want to make generalisations, but it doesn't, it usually just spreads the purchasing of those vegan, vegetarian options amongst the various items rather than increasing demand.
My vote's for the kangaroo, actually.
For kangaroo, I will pass that on.
Too.
On that note, it's the other portion for the crossbench. So, Mr. Latham or
The
Mr.
other
Borzak?
portion, did you say? Very nice segue, Chair.
Well, on the question of cuisine, as the only MP with a cookbook, could I
There's a plug.
boast of that and extend the position of food diversity put by my colleague Mr. Shoebridge? I very much welcome the curry cuisine, but do you find it's just a cheap European imitation with thin slices of kangaroo? When are we going to get some real curry cuisine on the menu, like koala and platypus?
I think we can just safely say never.
I would say I have no plans.
Say never.
I have no plans to serve either koala or platypus.
Seriously, we're just stuck with this cheap European imitation of kangaroo.
Active conservation has proved that if you eat them, they thrive as a species. There's no question of that.
Well,
So far,
Next question.
we've even got a member who'll capture and shoot them for us. So, okay, so the answer is never.
no plans to
That's
introduce.
sad to hear. That's sad to hear in terms of cultural authenticity. Could I ask, how much has the Hibbs consultancy cost, and are they still on our books?
Yes, Hibbs are still on our books, and I can provide you with some specific figures. Let me just find those.
We may have to take that on notice in that the arrangements are part of a commercial in confidence.
Are Hibbs and commercial in confidence?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I can tell
But we
you.
just have to consult with them before we release
I'm
it.
not wanting to see the contract. I'm wanting to know how much we've paid them so far. And if you could answer also, what's their ongoing role, given that effectively we've gone back to the COVID-safe arrangements we had in June?
I can answer the second.
Okay, we might take the second then.
The first part I'm happy to take on notice. We have an obligation where there's a commercial and confidence element to consult with the people before we release the figures. So we'll have to take that on notice. The relationship with Hibbs is still in place. We ask for specific advice around particular issues. Right now, we are seeking advice on the November sittings. The primary characteristic that's influencing what happens in November is the density limits. So at the moment, they're at 4 square metres. If they're at 2 square metres, this more impacts the Legislative Assembly than yourselves, but there's more options to have more people in that chamber. And of course, if they scrap the density limits completely, then we can restore all elements, including things like the restaurant and numbers of people in the cafe and the like through to normal through the original arrangement. So we are waiting on the health decisions around what the density limits will be as the primary characteristic about some of those items. We've asked Hibbs to prepare scenarios that cover those 3 areas, the 4 square metres, 2 square metres and no density limits. And I would anticipate that the November sittings will be the last time we'll need any such advice as by the time we come back in February.
When does the Hibbs retainer expire?
It will be after this November sittings, and it's not a retainer. We are just paying for the advice that we receive.
And how much did the Strangers dining room renovation cost, and what did it achieve? Because to a lot of MPs it looks the same as when you started.
Okay, might ask you to ask that.
I'll ask my excellent team who are watching to send me the exact figure of how much it costs while I talk about the other parts to your question. So the Strangers work is part of our overall ceiling and building services replacement program. So for those of you that are familiar with the history of the tower block, you'll know that it was built in the late 70s, commissioned in the early 80s. The building services in the ceiling have not been replaced since there. So by way of example, back then the Legislative Council positions were part-time with no staff, there were no computers in offices, etc., etc. So things like the air conditioning systems, the cabling and all the rest was not built with modern workplaces in mind. We have over the last few years been progressively replacing all of that in the ceiling. I very much hope that you, besides in the rest of the building, besides excellent new ceiling panels, I very much hope that you're not noticing much change, because all the changes up in the ceiling for the building services that are there. So for the strangers dining room, we did all of that replacement. So replacement of the air conditioning system, the cabling, etc. But the other piece of feedback we've received both from members and from external bodies that come in and do events here is that the audio-visual capacity of the strangers area was not sufficient for modern events and presentations. So we took the opportunity, we had received money through the digital transformation project to replace the audio-visual systems in both chambers, the committee rooms and the strangers area. So rather than do those two pieces of work separately, we combined them together, and while we had the strangers, while we had the roof down on the strangers, we replaced all the building services, but also put in new audio-visual capacity. Blinds, for instance, one of the things we often got was in the mornings, in particular if you were running an event, there were no blinds on the windows, so that if you did bring your own projector in, you couldn't see anything on the screen. So there were blinds there for either light management or privacy, depending on the nature of the event. So they're the primary things there. You're absolutely right. We did recondition the ceiling tiles, but I hope very much that the extensive work we did should be invisible to you, because that was the intent. We weren't trying to fundamentally change the nature of the room. We were trying to make sure it had the capacity to deal with the modern demands of function space.
Right, and further on renovation costs, how much does it cost to renovate the Speaker's courtyard? And while, of course, the ramp for disability access is understood, why did it have to be such an extensive renovation of other spaces instead of getting a few carpenters in to build a ramp within a couple of days?
Are you happy?
There are issues of comedy.
Yes, that's right. The Speaker's Garden is a space that is in the Speaker's area. I will ask my team to get me a sense of the cost, but we did build a ramp that's designed to fit the heritage nature of the Speaker's Garden, so it's not something that could be done with a couple of carpenters in a couple of days. It needs to meet the heritage requirements of the space. And in terms of further work, the only really further thing we did was take down the wall between it and the atrium, the northern atrium, in order to connect the two spaces. So that's the only extra work. And I should say the total cost of both the audio-visual and the building services work in the strangers area was $2.1 million.
$2.1 million.
The work was quite extensive.
Okay. And how much are we paying Elizabeth Broderick for her review of workplace culture and respect of women? Was that a competitive process that brought her on board, and what stage of her work is she at?
The work on the Speaker's Garden was $460,000.
$460,000?
Yes, that's correct.
Ramp.
Well, yes.
Get disabled access.
Yes.
It's a garden too.
Yes. Yes, that would be an excellent thing to be able to add, Mr. Franklin. I will have to take on notice the Elizabeth Broderick costs for the same reason as I took on notice the Hibbs cost. It's commercial in confidence, and we will have to consult with her first, which I'm happy to do. In terms of where she's at, sorry, you asked about the procurement process and then the status of it.
Process by which she was appointed.
No, we went through a single sourcing process for Elizabeth Broderick based on the requirements of the need to do the work. There aren't that many people that have the capacity and the reputation to undertake that kind of work. We followed all of the guidelines around single sourcing to ensure that we met all of the government procurement guidelines that we volunteer to comply with. In terms of where it's at, Ms Broderick has completed a desktop review of our policies and processes, and we're in the process of having a look at some of the feedback she's giving us. Her final report will incorporate all of this information, but we've asked her to progressively tell us about the things that she's finding so we can implement them straight away. We are about to kick off the next phase, which is a voluntary survey that people can or in the case of some may not wish to participate, and that's perfectly fine. And there is options for individuals or groups to have to be interviewed by Ms Broderick and their team if they want to give feedback more directly. And the intent is to gather an evidence base to determine whether there's further changes that might be required. Coming into this process, we felt that it was important to gather data on how things actually are, as opposed to making guesses or suppositions about how things are, and that's the process that we're looking at going through.
Okay, so we're fairly close to 11, so that means it's time for a break. So we'll just turn the broadcast off and we'll be back in at 11:15.
Very well, Madam Chair.
Still broadcasting.
When are we going to open to the public
Welcome
again?
back, everybody. I will hand over to the opposition, Mr. Diadam.
Chair, I wanted to come back to this question around the closed captioning contract. So, Mr. Webb, when was the contract left?
We've gone through a tender process and we're currently in contract negotiations.
So, can I ask about how the closed captioning works? Does that is that wholly an AI process, or is there a human dimension to that?
No, we had a look at both. So there is work going on, interesting work going on in a few jurisdictions around closed captioning and using technology. So the UK House of Commons, as examples, has been using a technology-based platform to produce closed captioning. The accuracy rate of it at the moment is only at about 85-86%, whereas the existing closed captioning services that are in Australia have an accuracy rate of around 99%. And we, at first, when we first were looking at it, we thought that the existing services might be too expensive for the budget that we had. But when we tested the market, it turned out that wasn't the case. So we'll be using the same kind of closed captioning service that existing broadcasting uses, which they do use technology, but there is still there's a human component to that technology that's used. So they use things like our Hansard team use, dictation software that they can speak the words into the system. Similar stuff for the closed caption, but it still has a human dimension to it. Of course, we're going to continue to monitor what our colleagues across the world do in this space. It's important that we keep an eye on what parliaments are doing, but at this point, it's a fairly traditional closed caption service to start off with.
So the human dimension, will they be domicile in Australia, or are they? Where are those individuals going to be located?
We haven't finished the contract negotiation.
The contract.
Yeah. Yes. I can say that all of the shortlisted contracts were Australia-based. So while we haven't finished the negotiations, I can confidently say it'll be done in Australia.
And you're seeking a contract term that specifically requires the human dimension of the captioning to be done by Australians in Australia.
Yes, that's correct.
And how long are you looking to contract for?
We're starting off with. I'll get the exact. I'll have that. I'll have the team send me the exact length. We're starting off with an initial contract, but the intention would be that we would extend it further. And we did seek funding for the ongoing provision of the service. So I will just get the team, who I know are listening intently, to send me the length of the initial contract that we're negotiating. But just again, just reiterating, we're still finalising those contract negotiations at the moment.
And what's the benchmark accuracy that you're looking for in the contract?
It's 99% based around a verbatim, so it would be a verbatim, not the excellent work that Hansard do to prepare the edited transcript still needs to occur. I know many of you say you never knew how good you sounded until you read your Hansard transcript back. This closed captioning is not an edited area, it is a verbatim transcription. The areas where these kind of closed captioning things tend to not be accurate is around place names and other unusual names, so proper nouns, if you like. That's where they tend to be perhaps not as accurate as other parts, but generally I believe it's quoted at, and my excellent team has told me that it's quoted as 98% accurate. And the the contract is for 12 months with additional 2-year extension possible if they meet the performance targets that we're outlining.
And can I ask what consultation's been involved in the process of adopting closed captioning? Like, is there some mechanism for MPs to be involved in the evaluation?
I might again ask my excellent team to talk about to send me a couple of notes about what consultations happened so far. We welcome any feedback from anyone on this. One of the reasons we set it up for the 12 months in the first instance was so that people had a chance to give us feedback on whether it's working or not, whether it's useful, not just from members, but from members' staff, and also the Hansard team, for instance, does the verbatim information that comes through. Is it useful in the Hansard production process or not? They're the kinds of bits of feedback we'll be seeking through the first 12-month contract. But that's why we didn't jump into a 3-year contract.
Fine. But will there be some structured evaluation process that will involve some consultation with
Yes.
Users?
Yes, absolutely. In the same way that with the Parliament On Demand system, you'll have noted recently we put out some surveys and sought feedback on whether that Parliament On Demand system was working to support you as members. We'll be doing similar things with the closed caption process as well to make sure that you're satisfied with that. We've also insisted that the closed captioning service meets all the applicable disability standards as well. And as a part of, once it's up and running, as a part of that tweaking and consultation process, we'll also be consulting with people from disability advocacy point of view, just to make sure that when they can actually see it in operation, is it actually doing what they need it to do from that perspective. I should say we're looking to trial the closed captioning technology in December with a couple of committees to start off with, just to get a sense of how that's working, and then extending it out to everything else over the next couple of months.
So the expectation is it will cover committees as well as sitting to the House?
Correct.
Right, okay. I might pass over to my colleague now.
Thank you. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Chair. I just want to loop back into this Broderick review on the advisory group on bullying and sexual harassment, serious misconduct. I'll place it on the record that the Labor opposition supports the review, but I just want to take you through some of the nuances of that. My understanding is that one of the unpublished findings of the advisory group is that some of the provisions of the code are a little bit inconsistent with protection of staff from misconduct. So it goes to the current drafting of the Code of Conduct and the principles of loyalty and confidentiality, which set up a bit of a conflict for a staff member who is hypothetically subject to bullying and harassment, feeling perhaps intimidated by raising it given the loyalty and confidentiality parameters. Did you want to just talk us through that?
Yes, without wanting to give away any or breach anyone's privacy, I think in a general sense it's true that one of the issues that's been raised has been the interplay between the requirements of members' staff around loyalty and confidentiality and the fact that the current member code of conduct doesn't go to behavioural elements at all. And so there's a potential either reality or perception that loyalty could mean not complaining about being bullied, like some people may interpret the loyalty provision through that lens. I don't think any reasonable member would look at the loyalty provision and say, oh no, that means you have to put up with bullying, but the concern was that people might perceive that they had limited avenue to raise things, especially when you reflect on the members' code of conduct and realise there's nothing in it about behaviour and treating people with respect and the like. I know some of these matters are being canvassed through the proposals around the compliance officer, and I'd welcome if David wanted to add anything on that regard. And I think it has pointed us towards perhaps a more fulsome description of what loyalty means in the context of a member's staff code of conduct. I don't think anybody around this table would expect that loyalty means putting up with bullying and harassment of any type. So we want to make sure that we can tease that out and provide clearer advice to member staff about how to handle those kinds of situations. David, was there anything on the compliance officer and the changes to the code of conduct?
Maybe just two things, if I could, Mr. Buttigieg. In relation to the compliance officer proposal, you'd no doubt be aware that Both privileges committees of the LC and the LA have now reported supporting the proposal, but each with a number of recommendations, and there's been quite a bit of work going on behind the scenes in recent weeks to try and work through the slight nuances between the two committees. Mr. President kicked the matter along significantly by referring to the LC Privileges Committee a follow-up reference requiring it to inquire into and report expeditiously on how to effectively get the proposal across the line so that someone can give a notice of motion in one of the houses to get this matter back before members for consideration and hopefully adoption and implementation ASAP. So that's not too far away. Secondly, just further to what Mark was saying, as members would be aware, I think the newly elected members in 2019, this whole issue of harassment and bullying was one that we sought to address during the induction program. It is a vexed and difficult issue, of course, and parliaments around the world have been grappling with this issue in recent times. One of the things that both Mark and I and our colleague, the Clerk of the Assembly, have been emphasising since then in the induction of staff, both member staff and parliamentary staff, is a message around respect in the workplace, that all staff are expected to respect all members, regardless of political, who the staffer works for and who the member is, not only their own member, but also to expect to be treated with respect, and that if they find themselves not treated with respect by colleagues or any member, they have our encouragement to push back politely, but also our doors are open.
So I don't think there's any debate about the intentions of everyone and all of us being on the same page in terms of the outcomes. I just kind of want to zero in on some of the inherent difficulties regarding the contradictions, I suppose, inherent, say, in the MOPS Act, where there's no reason for dismissal, and how that sets up with a staff member coming forward in the context of that, and then what role or value add, if any, will the compliance officer play in attenuating that conflict, I suppose, in the absence of us changing the MOPS Act, of course.
So I can probably handle the first part of that, Mr. President. Yep, and David might have some comments on the second part. Yes, you're quite right. The Parliament, when passing the Members of Parliament Staff Act, included the capacity to both hire members' staff without any merit-based process, and also to terminate that employment. And one of the, I guess, the compensating elements of that was that a member's staff who is terminated for no reason gets a remuneration, a payout that is the equivalent of what you would get if you went to the Industrial Relations Commission to challenge an employment ending. That was a deliberate design decision made by the Parliament at the time for the employment of members' staff.
And I think just for the record, I think both the Labor opposition and the Greens opposed that at the time, was my understanding. Yeah.
Fair, yeah. I wasn't here at the time, so I don't recall that. But the feature is there in the legislation. I should note that the Discrimination Act still applies. Someone can't be terminated for discriminatory reasons, and that is something that is still in place at the moment. But it is true that members don't need to go through an extensive performance management process to terminate. But in the public sector, if someone does go through a extensive performance management process and are eventually terminated, they don't get compensation for that, whereas
So I understand the quid pro quo. I just want to get to how we resolve this contradiction inherent in there, and what, if any, role the compliance officer will play in that.
Did you want to talk about the compliance officer?
Yes, thanks, Mark. Just on the compliance officer, Mr. Buttigieg, of course, the proposal for the compliance officer deals with a number of sort of jurisdictional gaps between nothing and ICAC in the space of members' use of entitlements, members' disclosures of pecuniary interests, and code of conduct matters, including bullying and harassment. So in that bullying and harassment space, one of the things that's built into the original proposal, as per the motions that went through the House and the LA last year, sending this matter off to the committees, but also inherent in the reports of the two privileges committees, is an emphasis upon complaints about any of these matters, but particularly sensitive matters concerning bullying and harassment, being dealt with as quickly as possible and confidentially. Now, one of the areas of nuance between the two committees is in relation to reporting, the specific circumstances in which there is a report on the matter, but built into the proposed resolution and the reports of the two committees is that one aspect of reporting is the consent of the complainant. It's a really important safeguard there.
I just want to take you to some training that was introduced for members' staff to understand safe practices when engaging with distressed constituents, particularly relevant given the pandemic and, you know, the flood of calls people have been having. Is there a proposal to have that as part of regular updated training rather than just a one-off given the spike with the pandemic?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, Mr. Buttigieg. Yes, the feedback that we've got is that the training's been very well received, and that its applicability could go beyond the particular crisis that we find ourselves in. So we are looking at introducing it as a regular part of our training regime.
Okay, good. The other bit of feedback I've had from the staff is that some of them found it very difficult to attend because there was no relief available. It would be able to consider some relief arrangement so people can attend that sort of training.
Yeah, that's something that's being actively considered at the moment. The current determination indicates that short-term relief is only available under very specific circumstances for training, so that is something that we're reviewing at the moment.
I also want to take you back to something we touched on earlier with regards to employee entitlements and the comparison between, say, the sessional staff who have got that extra 10 days given the hours that they work, and it's sort of embedded into the parliamentary cycle, I guess. But it's quite clear that you could make the same argument, the analogy for a lot of members' staff. Is consideration being given to the possibility of them receiving an extra 10 days as well? I mean, we've got all sorts of issues where staff are forced to take leave over the Christmas break. They're working long hours, essentially the same as the sessional staff, but they've got this disparity in extra leave.
All conditions, including leave, are included in this review that we're doing. So, yeah, we'll be looking at what's the most appropriate way to compensate for the unusual work hours that member staff go through. So it could include leave. It could include, there's currently the all incidents allowance. There's other compensation mechanisms that could be in play. Basically, it's all on the table to be reviewed.
Okay. Just in terms of technology for staff too, another issue we've come across is the fact that in order for them to access the IT infrastructure in Parliament, emails and whatnot, they've got their own devices, and they actually have to have, my understanding is, the latest iteration of an iPhone or a Samsung in order to facilitate that software, and there's sometimes significant upgrade costs involved. That's obviously an issue for staff who, you know, are out of pocket just simply to do their jobs. Have we given any thought to perhaps allocating devices to staff members so that they don't have that upgrade cost, or compensating them for the upgrade cost?
No, we haven't given any consideration to that, but I am happy to give consideration to that. There are options for the production of tokens that allow for the access that don't use your phone, so there might be some things that we could do there as well.
My only quick one, Chair, is that there might be, you get to do a submission to the PRT, which could go to some of these things.
They could do, yes, absolutely. And just a reminder that all members can also make submissions directly as well. I encourage you to do so.
Thanks,
Those submissions are due by the end of the month.
Yes, thanks.
Mr Shivridge.
Thanks, Chair. Mr Webb, it might just be useful to finish some of that discussions about assisting staff do their job. One of the ongoing concerns I know in my office, and when I speak to other colleagues their offices, when staff have short periods of leave, there's quite the assumption is that that's not backfilled for short periods of leave, and that means the staff return to just an increased pile of work, which can be quite distressing for them, and I think unfair. Now, I think that change about short-term relief only came into effect a few years ago. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, and again, I should say at the start, this is another area that we have been looking at. I think there was, at one point, the rule was that the person had to be away for a week before they could get, and I'll just get my excellent staff to send me a note in case what I'm saying is incorrect, but my understanding is that we have dropped that down to a day, so that if someone does go away for a day, they can be backfilled to bring some consistency around that. But I do know there have been questions about whether if someone takes half a day's leave, for instance, and whether there might be some options there. So we are looking at that as well.
Well, I mean, this is a matter that has concerned me. I wasn't aware that the policy change had happened to where you take a day's leave, that backfill is available. Could that be communicated clearly to all members and staff?
Yeah, happy to.
When did that change happen?
I'm sure my very excellent people will send me a note to tell me exactly when it happened, and I will immediately tell you that.
All right. And I want to indicate, look, where it's created specific instances of difficulty in my office, at least in my dealings with you, you've always been amenable to trying to resolve things, but the policy has been the problem.
Absolutely.
Could I ask you about the, perhaps to you, Mr Blunt, about what the time frame is for getting the Parliamentary Compliance Officer in place? I mean, what sort of time frame can we be expecting?
As I said while you were out of the room, Mr Shivridge, Mr President gave a reference to the Legislative Council Privileges Committee some weeks ago for the committee to report as expeditiously as possible on essentially how to harmonise the positions of the LC committee and the LA committee. Work is well underway in that regard. There have been extensive discussions at an officer level, and I understand between certain members of the two committees, and Mr Reynolds, I'm sure, will confirm if I'm misleading the committee, but I understand that a report is already underway, being drafted for the chair of the LC committee.
In terms of the resourcing requirements, what are the additional resourcing requirements of getting a parliamentary compliance officer?
So the first step in the implementation after the LC committee reports would be a member giving a notice of motion, and the motion, if it starts in the LC, being considered, debated, and it's ultimately a decision for members whether that resolution is adopted and in what form, and then a message being sent to the Assembly and for them to deal with in the same way. Immediately, a resolution is passed by both houses. The 3 department heads will work with the presiding officers on the recruitment of a suitable person or persons for their names to be put before the privileges committees for review and confirmation. When the resolution was first put before each house this time last year, the proposal was that recruitment be finalised before the middle of this year. So if things progressed over the next 3 sitting weeks, for instance, I think the goal would be to have someone in place by the end of the financial year. In terms of resources, we don't anticipate this costing a lot. Unless the person is overwhelmed by complaints about members' conduct, which we don't expect, we expect essentially someone to be effectively put on a retainer, be paid a fee to be available continuously for the duration of their term, and when they do need to deal with the matter,
scales up and scales down as needed.
If necessary,
yes.
if the amount of work is more than the retainer. But we're not talking about a significant amount of money. We're not talking about more than what it costs for one of my full-time employees, for instance.
Like John Evans as the ethics advisor.
That's exactly the model.
Well, I want to be clear. My party, the Greens, strongly endorse us getting that position as soon as possible. And my only concern is if we can't get cooperation with the other place, whether or not, if that is a sticking point, whether it's a possibility to go as a separate measure in the LC.
I think we're confident of getting agreement. Close.
Well, we'll cross that bridge and hopefully we won't have to come to it.
There's been a lot of work that's gone on behind the scenes to get to this point, so I think we're almost there.
Going to the costs, one of the concerns that I think many members in the opposition and crossbench have had is the sheer number of baseless privilege claims that have been made by the government under SO 52 and the number of matters that have gone to the arbiter. Do you have an indication, Mr. Blunt, of how many disputed matters have gone to the arbiter?
During the last financial year, the Legislative Council was required to engage the services of 3 arbiters. Mr. Brett Walker dealt with one matter at a cost of $1,100. The Honourable Joseph Campbell dealt with one matter at a cost of $8,550, and the Honourable Keith Mason dealt with around 20 matters at a total cost of $31,999.
Now, I've got to say that in relation to bills for $1,100.
Sorry,
I didn't know Brett Walker issued bills for $1,100. Congratulations on that.
Can I just say that in relation to each of those 3 people, and particularly the ongoing work of Keith Mason, the Legislative Council gets the most excellent value for money from people of such amazing standing and legal knowledge.
I say for Keith Mason, a jurist of his seniority, to deal with 20 matters for those figures. I mean, I'd endorse what you say. But do you have a win-loss ratio for the government on those matters?
It would be in the order. Well, I'm not sure it's about winning and losing. It's about
well, perhaps I'll phrase it a different way. How many of the privilege claims were not upheld?
In relation to 22 or 23 matters in the last financial year, during that financial year, it may be that there were some parts of 1 or 2 of those privilege claims that were upheld.
So none of them upheld in total, and at best partial success in 1 or 2?
Again, again, I'm loath to use the terms success or failure or win or lose. It's about the Legislative Council getting thorough and reliable advice in evaluating the claims, but ultimately the decisions are yours in the House.
Would it be fair to say that overwhelmingly the arbiters were not persuaded by the privilege claims being made by the government?
Yes.
What kind of additional delay is that putting on the release of documents? How long is this taking?
Late last year, former President Ajaka convened a roundtable that I recall you being in attendance at, Mr Shoebridge, together with the independent legal arbiter, with representatives of the government, opposition, crossbench and DPC. And I recall that one of the statements made during that roundtable meeting was that if I can paraphrase DPC, that because of the extraordinary volume of orders, that in their view there wasn't time to necessarily do all the due diligence required to ensure that all private information, for instance, was redacted, and so therefore there were some privilege claims that were being made that were perhaps broader than would ordinarily happen if more time was available.
But Mr. Blank goes well beyond that. I mean, the privilege claims continue to be made based upon privilege elements of the GIPA Act, which that's an argument that has not been accepted by a single arbiter ever. No. Is there any structured engagement in place with the DPC and other agencies so as they can stop making such grossly unmeritorious privilege claims?
So we'll ask for the answer for that, but then it's time's expired.
When the House resumed in February, March this year, former President Ajaka tabled a report on the outcome of that round table meeting, which included a document summarising, in effect, the jurisprudence of Mr Mason in particular, but also other arbiters, and that has been I hope, a useful educative resource for the public service out in the clusters, and I understand that DPC have sought to make that document available widely. There are no doubt other things that can be done as well.
Look, and just very briefly, it's about the Premier's memorandum that goes out and how they actually comply with that. So it's an ongoing discussion, and in that regard, as I mentioned earlier, look, we're looking at doing a practice note to try and facilitate that and to ensure that the expectations of the House are well known to the bureaucracy through that memorandum process. So that's something that we're looking to do, and I'm hopeful will be something that will short-circuit some of these problems, particularly in relation to privilege.
Mr Latham?
Oh, thanks, Chair. Just coming back to Mr Webb's point about gathering the evidence base for Elizabeth Broderick, has there been a referral to her inquiry of the two high-profile public matters with regard to disrespect of women in this building? For instance, there was the social media post by Lauren Gillen, formerly worked for Mr Shoebridge here, accusing him of sexism, bullying, intimidation, abuse and humiliation. Is that part of the evidence base that's been referred on to the Broderick inquiry? And the second one, I suppose it's only come up and been reinforced in the last 24 hours, is the member for Willoughby seemingly persistently lying to her female chief of staff in the matters before ICAC yesterday, and also the notorious Leeton UWE matter before ICAC last year. Now, obviously, respect for women starts with telling them the truth in our positions as members of Parliament. So these are two high-profile matters that have gained media attention in the past 12 months. So do they come within the remit of this very important Broderick review?
Ms. Broderick and her team haven't been engaged to investigate specific complaints, so they're not looking into specific complaints and judging the merit of those complaints or not. They're looking at the processes, procedures, culture, and recommendations to change at an institution level, not looking into individual complaints. With the second issue that you raise, of course, the situation that involves ministerial staff and the member for Willoughby in a capacity on the executive side of things. So even if we were looking into individual complaints, that one wouldn't have been in the mix, but we're not looking into individual complaints. We're looking at patterns and overall settings for the institution.
How do you judge patterns without looking at individual complaints that might form a pattern?
Well, anyone can participate in either the survey or the interviews and provide information. What I'm saying is Ms. Broderick and her team will not be investigating those complaints to form a conclusion about them. They'll be just accepting any information that's provided as part of developing an evidence base.
Right, so can a former staff member like Lauren Gillen come forward, or is it limited to current staff?
No, we're opening it up to anybody. Yeah.
So they will be notified. Anyone.
They will be as part of the.
So if you've got relevant matters, you can sit down with Ms. Broderick and have a talk about them.
If we still have contact details for them. We don't have contact details for everyone that's ever worked at the Parliament, but if we do have contact details, we will be. Well, I should say, when I say we take the confidentiality of the process extremely clearly. We'll be doing a general communication telling people where things are up to, but it'll be Ms. Broderick that engages. So we will be passing on messages on her behalf, none of the information will be routed through David, myself, the clerk of the LA, or any parts of the administration.
And what's the expectation for completing the Broderick report?
We're expecting the report back in March next year.
Have you got that expenditure on the bollards?
Yes, $1.95 million. Yes, indeed.
20 years after September 11, this was supposed to be some security measure, is that right?
Yes. As per the long-standing practice, I don't propose to comment on security vulnerabilities of the Parliament in an open public session, but I am very happy to talk to members of the committee in private session about what the reasoning behind any security measures that we have are.
And what was the original cost estimate for that work?
It's within the budget that we originally.
I'm sure it is, but what did we expect it to cost initially when this idea was presented for expenditure?
Around $2 million.
$2 million. So knowingly, it was thought that those bollards would be worth $2 million, and this is the expectation.
Yes.
Is there a breakdown on the renovation of the Speaker's courtyard, how much the ramp cost as opposed to the other?
I don't have that with me, so I'll have to take that on notice.
In the envelope of the $460? It's a bargain compared to the bollards, isn't it?
Certainly cheaper.
Some of these things just leave you breathless. Our new Aboriginal liaison officer, what work's he been doing west of the Great Dividing Range in the most disadvantaged Indigenous communities in New South Wales?
As you know, since our new Aboriginal liaison officer came on board, there have been significant travel restrictions around the great state of New South Wales. So in terms of physically visiting those communities, he hasn't had that opportunity as yet. But he works in the context of the communications, engagement and education team that have been looking at outreach programs across the entire state. Which includes Aboriginal, trying to engage Aboriginal people with the institution of Parliament more broadly.
So is it the intention he'll spend time in seats like Barwon and Murray, Dubbo, when the restrictions make that possible?
We want to engage with Indigenous communities across all of New South Wales, yes.
So he'll be going west of the...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is not a Sydney-centric approach.
I think there was one committee that he actually visited from memory, I think in the Central West, if my memory serves me correctly, but David will check that. So he has been out with one committee to help facilitate hearings, but I actually have put a project to Stephen in relation to looking at with support of some of the members out west, particularly a member for Barwon and others, to look at how we actually could take some of the Parliament out there and do a real visit to some of these areas, not just in a committee context, but in a real see what the conditions are on the ground context. Go out to Wilcannia, for example, and actually meet with the Aboriginal community there and do something that's much more, if you like, significant than a transient committee visit actually gives you the opportunity to do. So there are some parameters around that Stephen's working with, and indeed with those discussions with some of the local members to try and facilitate that, to give members an opportunity to go out and see how difficult the conditions are in some areas of New South Wales. And that's something that I've asked a project to be sort of worked up so we can perhaps tap into that once the travel restrictions are removed next year.
Well, that sounds an excellent proposition. I think we should have a structured program to make sure we're always visiting the most disadvantaged parts of New South Wales and understanding the task of providing better opportunities for those communities, because when you go there, it's horrific. And we don't get that direct awareness if we base ourselves too much.
And Stephen is doing excellent work facilitating that connection with the community. He has boosted our capacity in this space immeasurably since he came on board, an excellent addition to the Parliament.
Glad to hear that. Just back on some costings and expenditure, the bust of Virginia Chadwick, what's the cost estimate there to place that?
It has arrived in the building.
Chamber?
Yes, I will have to look that up. If you would ask another question while I do that.
Okay. Where did the rainbow flags go on the front desk?
Oh, the LA front desk.
They disappeared. I'm not saying I'm complaining about that. I'm just interested in the decision making by which they were removed.
Those flags were there for a particular event, as I understand it, and when it was noted that the event had finished, they were removed.
A long-running event. What was that event?
I can't recall off the top. It was one of the Pride in Diversity days. I can't remember the exact details. It was a while ago.
Right. And who are the team from measurement? Aisha, Paulvale and Tuhina, and what are they measuring, and what do we pay them, and what impact do they have on the workings of the building?
Yes, so part of doing the ceiling and building services project is that we've also been looking at the corporate accommodation that sits underneath that. If we're pulling apart the ceiling, whether we need to make any changes to where walls are, all that kind of thing as well. So what they've been looking at is how people use the building, where people move through, whether there's any, whether that has changed in the years since the tower block was originally built, and whether there's any adjustments that we need to make as a part of doing that work to support the operation of the Parliament.
So these are consultants that...
Yeah.
How much do we pay them?
I don't have that figure with me.
Mr. Webb, why can't you and your team work out the movements inside the building? It's not a complex Parliament House, I can assure you, compared to some others.
Compared to some others.
Simple. Kindy kids could make their way around here. So why do we need to bring in consultants to work out, in your words, how people are moving and walls that might need to be taken down?
That's part of the corporate accommodation process that we've been going through. We've brought in people that are expert in corporate accommodation, and it's done as part of that project. And the bust costs $104,000 for the bust.
Who's the artist for that?
And the flags were there for Mardi Gras.
Right, okay, well, that's good. Who's the artist that gets the $104,000?
Doesn't get all of that, but I would have to get... Have you got that with you? Yeah, fantastic.
So, Mr. Latham, in relation to the bust of the late Honourable Virginia Chadwick, first female President of the Legislative Council and former Minister, the project to commission that bust got underway following the passage of a resolution in the Legislative Council agreed to by the House on the 9th of March 2016. It's taken it's taken some time to come to fruition, but as Mr. President said, the
Five and a half years. Who's doing it? Michelangelo.
The bust is now here and will be unveiled on a date to be advised by the President after consultation with the family. It will be a wonderful event and a tribute to the late Honourable Virginia Chadwick. The bust has been sculpted by renowned Australian sculptor. Now, please forgive me if I get the pronunciation wrong, but Peter Schipperhein.
We'll have to return to this. It's opposition time. Mr. Buttigieg.
Thank you, Chair. Let's just loop back to some questions on technology. I just want to finish off that line that I was pursuing earlier. So one of the problems we've got, which was highlighted during the pandemic, was the staff get allocated a device per FTE, per full-time equivalent. And of course, if you're stuck at home, it's a bit hard to share around a laptop if you've got multiple staff. Has there been consideration for allocating a computer to each individual staff member as opposed to FTE, because it really hampers their ability to do their job again?
Yes, we have been looking at that issue. You're quite right. The provision of desktop computers tended to be on the basis of an FTE because people would share a desk, but harder to do that with people doing remote working. So we have looked at some flexibility around that and have been in circumstances providing laptops per person. I would say that if a member decided to hire one person per day of the week and so had 5 people against a single FTE, we might struggle to provide 5 laptops, but within a reasonable split, we have been doing that across the board. One of the biggest issues we have at the moment with the rollout of laptops is the worldwide shortage of computer chips and the implications that's had for laptops. So laptops that previously we had a 3 to 4 week lead time, we now have 4-month lead time, and the vendors are telling us they can't guarantee supply even in that area. So that has slowed down our rollout of additional laptops out to people.
Mr. Webb, I take that to mean that it's not so much a lack of monetary resource, it's more the supply is not there. There's a will to go down that path.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. I just want to, this is something I raised at the last round, and I know there's issues about lines of responsibility in terms of the special constable's pay and the fact that it's the Department of Police its remit. But former President Ajaka gave an undertaking that he would pursue the matter in the context of the Parliament pays, my understanding is a global contract for the constables, and therefore may have some influence over their pay in terms of what the contract pays. And I don't think he gave an undertaking to write to the Minister to that effect, but he did give an undertaking to pursue the matter. Has there been any maturity of that discussion?
Look, I do have the transcript in front of me from last time round, and I think the former President made it pretty clear that he didn't believe he had a basis on which to intervene or make representations. And it's a question for the police force, and indeed those special constables are employed in different places across the state for different purposes, and it's a matter for the police department who provide them, if you like, as under contract to the Parliament.
Yeah, okay. I think you wouldn't be of the view that it would be not within the realms of possibility that you could write to the Minister expressing concerns about the rate of pay, given the relativity to other police functionaries, given the work they do for the Parliament?
I think it's pretty safe to say I have the same attitude as the former President, in the sense that this is a matter for the police department. They provide a service to us under contract, and we're very pleased with the service that they do provide. As to the issues you raise, I'm not aware of there being any concerns in that regard, but if there are, I'm happy to have a look at those concerns and take those on notice, but I'm not aware of any concerns of the nature that you've raised.
Well, I can assure you, from the perspective of a constable performing duties that they perform, that the pay is grossly inadequate, and I think we have a responsibility to at least raise it and try and do whatever we can about it. But anyway, I'll pursue that in another forum. Hospital road safety, I had raised this in the past. Not much seems to have been done. When you come up Hospital Road, notwithstanding the very low speed limit, you would have all noticed there's a bike sort of parking bay there which impedes the visibility of the pedestrian crossing which links the Domain and the Eye Hospital. And it's very, very hard to see people approaching that pedestrian crossing, and I could foresee a time when someone's distracted, someone comes up to the pedestrian crossing and they get bowled over. I've raised this on several occasions before. I know it's in the remit of the Royal Botanic Trust, I think, but if we had any dialogue with them on that, because I do think it's dangerous, and there seems to be a general view that that's the case.
We haven't had any recent engagement with them, but I'm happy to make representations again to them.
Yeah, we'll certainly do that, because I certainly share your concerns. It's pretty dangerous there at the pedestrian crossings, and people can come out there pretty quickly, even if you are travelling at a slow clock. So I think we can certainly make representations in that regard.
Yes, my understanding is the same as yours, Mr. Buttigieg. The Royal Botanic Gardens and Domain Trust are responsible for that road, but I'm happy to write to them making that representation.
We'll undertake to do that.
Thank you.
Indeed, it'd be great to see the vision of the whole Macquarie East precinct come to the fore in terms of the redevelopment of Hospital Road and taking the cars and other potential obstructions out of that whole precinct would be wonderful to see, but we'll live in hope on that front.
I know we've touched on this before, so the e-returns platform, the SO52s, do we have I might have been distracted on previous answers on this. Do we have a timeline on when that's likely to be the rubber hit the road, in case, we'd like to get at least a couple of months in opposition value out of it before we get elected in March, but can you give us a rough idea?
Okay, I might ask the clerk to give you an update. While he's finding that, there are a couple of threshold issues that were mentioned in that regard, and that is obviously the executive's agreement to the rollout of this. There's been a lot of work between the department and Premier and Cabinet in that regard, and I think that's well advanced. But there's some, sort of what I'd call threshold issues that need to be sorted out between the executive, and also how we deal with privileged documents. That's been a sticking point as well. So the privilege issue will continue on that front. So I think that's the sort of background, but in terms of the progress of the project itself, subject to those threshold issues, David might give us an update.
Unless one of the staff can send me a message that's more specific, the information I have in front of me is that sometime in the first half of next year, it's anticipated that there will be a product which can be the basis of consultation with members, but also for DPC to consult, to show and consult with agencies. So there should be something for to look at in the first half of next year, and then thereafter it's a matter for those two threshold decisions by government and by the House.
Okay, thanks.
Jump in if that's okay, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely, jump in. Yep.
That kind of video on demand. I just wanted to ask, will the closed captioning extend to the video demand stream that can be used by members? So will that be part of that process as well, or is this just for the broadcast of Parliament?
It's our intent to integrate it with the video on demand system. So it might not be there on day one, but that's the intent, is to integrate it so you can have access to that closed captioning with what you download from the video on demand system.
And I just on notice, is that going to be hard coded into the video, or is that going to be available as a sort of separate?
Yeah, I might need to take that on notice. I know some people want a clean feed of just the video, and some people might want the closed captioning. So I think that's one of the issues we need to work through as part of once we've signed a contract with the closed captioning people.
And I also wanted to know whether whether there's any consideration being given to having the video on demand available for the media room.
Yes, indeed it is available for the media now. It wasn't on day one. We wanted to make sure members were happy with the service before we extended it, but we've subsequently made it available.
Okay, and what about under the tree of knowledge? Is there any thought about having some service available for, given during the parliamentary sitting week, there's a lot of activity that's effectively an extension of the processes of the parliament occurring in that location. Has any consideration been given to having a service that would capture that?
The simple answer is no. It's outside the parliamentary precinct, and certainly not within our jurisdiction in that sense. So obviously, if that's something the television channels or cameramen want to pick up, well, that's obviously something for them.
Okay. Back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Chair. I just want to quickly zoom in on member staff and facility. I know this has been raised before. So we have this situation which I think was highlighted during some of those marathon sittings, but it's a general malaise. So basically when the LA clocks off, we're left to our own devices in terms of food down there, right, in terms of decent feed. And I understand the economics of it, right? If there's not enough demand there, we can't really justify. But it is really unacceptable for us not to be able to get something decent to eat, and staff as well, for that matter, just because the LA is not here. Where are we with all that?
Happy.
I certainly take the same view. If the House is sitting, then there should be a facility for members to access a decent meal. So there's been a trial, which has been ongoing. Obviously, we've had some issues with COVID, but that's continuing. And on a Thursday night where it's only the LC sitting, that will be provided. And I think we made a comment a bit earlier about opening that up to the public in due course, so that we can seek to defray the costs somewhat. But that's the plan on a trial basis to see how that goes. But my disposition is to provide the service to members, because that's really in support of the Parliament, and obviously the executive group will need to consider the outcome of the trial, but that's certainly my disposition is to continue it, but that's obviously subject to those discussions.
Okay. On a related issue, so my understanding is historically staff were afforded a dedicated dining space in one of the rooms. I think it was it this one or the Macquarie?
It used to be the Macquarie room. Yes. I think the Macquarie room used to be the staff dining room.
And that was discontinued, but I do think it's a bit unfair given the hours that staff are working, and they're sort of embedded in the parliamentary machinery and that 24/7 cycle, that they don't have a place where they can actually, for the benefit of someone's well-being, we all know when you're working long days, the idea of sitting down for at least half an hour and having a decent meal. Has there been any thought given to offering them a dedicated space where they can, rather than, having to traipse through the canteen and go back up to the office?
So at the moment, obviously the COVID situation's been a little different in that we haven't been able to have tables in Cafe Quorum for a lot of time over the last couple of years. But generally speaking, the Cafe Quorum and the public cafe are both kept open until the end of the sitting and have seating available in it, and of course the Strangers restaurant as well. I haven't given any consideration to a dedicated space beyond that. To be honest, I'm not sure where I would put it, so that would be something that I would have to think about. But space is at a premium in the Parliament at the moment.
Okay. I do think it's an issue we need to deal with. The other thing too is I've noticed anecdotally, I'm not sure if it's the experience of other members, but the catering staff down there and the members seem to be quite run off their feet. Like, you'll often go down there and might take a while. I'm not blaming them. They do an excellent job, very diligent and attentive. But sometimes it takes a while for them to take your order, and then by the time and if you're a bit pressed for time to get back into the chamber, it's sometimes a bit squeezed. Has an analysis been done of the quantum of staff relative to the requirement and the demand down there? I know you've got this diabolical problem of dealing with peaks and then what do we do with them for the rest of the time, but it is really quite chronic, I think. Yeah.
We do look at that quite closely, but you're quite right. We don't always predict correctly how much patronage we're going to get from members in the members' dining room. So sometimes there are occasions where we, based on previous weeks and other patterns, we might put a certain staffing profile in, and then it turns out that the Premier's asked all members to go to the restaurant, or something happens beyond our knowledge, and suddenly we get a rush coming through. We do try to prioritise the service of members on a sitting night, so we do move people from other parts of the building to support the operation of the members' dining room where we can. But what you point to is reasonable. There are times when we predict incorrectly how much patronage we're going to get, but we're continuously looking at it. The team does an excellent job trying to guess at that. Equally, and you wouldn't have seen this, there have been times where we've had extra staff on and nobody turns up, so they end up standing around for a little bit. But I can't pretend that we always get it 100% right, because it's inherently difficult to predict.
Yeah, it just seems to me as though that, there may have to be a bit of fat built into the system, or some sort of, as you say, opening up to the public or whatever, but I do think it's a problem. In terms of procurement, can you give it, I know we've raised this before, can you give us an idea of the statistics of procurement of things like furniture in the Parliament over, say, the last 3 or 4 years, the proportion of local procurement vis-a-vis, I think you gave the example before of the frosted glass door from San Francisco versus that sort of thing, because obviously we're keen to understand that we want local procurement prioritised wherever possible.
I don't have the exact figures with me, but I'm happy to take that on notice. As a general rule, we prioritise procurement from New South Wales first, from Australia if we can't get it in New South Wales, and then only go overseas if we can't get things in Australia. But in terms of the specific proportions, I'd have to take that on notice. I don't have those figures in front of me.
Is that, how is that administered? I mean, if you've got someone looking at frosted glass, and what do they do, a Google search of suppliers in New South Wales, and if no one comes up, then they go overseas?
It depends on the value of the contract, and it depends, because there are also procurement rules in place as well. When you get to a certain value of contract, you have to run an open tender, for instance. What we do a few different things depending on the value of the contract. If it's a low value contract and we're single sourcing, for instance, some of you may remember a line of questioning about milk provision here at the Parliament and where we source our milk from. That's a very low value, 25,000 a year in milk. So we're able to directly source that from a New South Wales provider in the Wagga Wagga region. If we get to higher end ones where we need to seek multiple quotes or go out to open tender, the team will review whether there's anybody in New South Wales or more broadly in Australia that is active in the space that we're procuring for, and make sure we invite those people to participate in the tender. So we do stick to the highest standards of probity and procurement, but we do try to make sure that there's knowledge in the New South Wales or Australian market as to what we what we're doing so that people can participate in that. And then it's a factor then in the decision making. If the Australian version of something is 3 times the cost, well, obviously we have to make decisions in the use of taxpayers' money. But if you were talking about 2 that were roughly even and one was a New South Wales-based product and one was an overseas product, well, then that could be the determining factor in what gets across the line.
Okay, you'll get back to us on the proportion.
Yeah, I will. Yeah.
In terms of staff and the joint consultative committee process, how many times have you attended that JCC with staff over, say, the last 18 months? Can you give us an indicative?
So the process for the JCC that we have is that one of the 3 department heads attends each meeting and representing all 3 of us. So myself, David and the Clerk of the Legislative Assembly split that duty amongst us. So I have attended a third of the JCC meetings over the last couple of years, as has Mr Blunt, as has Ms Minikin, but we represent all of management, all of the department head level of management. Of course, one of my staff, one of my senior executive who is in charge of HR amongst other things, is the management representation in that meeting on an ongoing basis for consistency. The department head representative attends for a proportion of the meeting to answer any questions or give any information about things relevant to our position. So I've attended, in short, every JCC meeting that I've been scheduled to attend.
Okay, thanks.
Mr Latham.
Thanks, Chair. Could I just ask about something mentioned earlier, the ethics advisor? I'm straining to remember who it was, but there's someone who, an MP, maybe a former MP, who took some advice from the ethics advisor that was then interrogated at ICAC. The advice itself was a document under examination at ICAC. It doesn't really matter who it was in these recent hearings. But doesn't this negate the whole impact of the ethics advisor? I mean, if you've got an ethics dilemma and you're wanting to get advice from the advisor and it's not confidential and the matters that you're putting on the table can be subsequently interrogated at the Anti-Corruption Commission, haven't we got a problem? And the ethics advisor sort of becomes, like for serious ethical issues, sort of becomes a bit redundant because you wouldn't go there knowing that one day it might be public knowledge.
Mr Latham, the ethics advisor is one of my predecessors, former esteemed Clerk of the Parliament's John Evans, who is jointly appointed by a resolution of both houses. And you're correct in your recollection. I understand it was in the context of Operation Keppel that some of his advice to a former member was became an exhibit at the ICAC, and I do understand that has members have some concerns around that. However, I can assure you that knowing Mr Evans as I do, and he's a person of great standing and someone for whom I have the utmost respect, he wouldn't have produced those documents to the ICAC under compulsion unless he was absolutely sure that he had no choice but to do so.
I don't doubt that, but ICAC's subpoenaed the documents effectively, haven't they?
Under Section 21 or Section 22.
What are we doing about this? Because obviously members will be very reluctant to go talk about private, confidential ethics issues if they become exhibits at ICAC. Now, maybe some of them need to be exposed at ICAC, but that's not the point of the ethics advisor, is it?
Can I suggest that you raise your concerns via, well, you've raised your concerns here, so we can pass them on, but the Privileges Committee is required to meet annually with the Ethics Advisor, so it's a matter the Privileges Committee could discuss with the Ethics Advisor when it next has that meeting. Also, the Privileges Committee is required once in each term of Parliament to review the members' code of conduct, and so that will be coming up. That's often during the last year of the parliamentary term. So again, that would be an opportunity for the sorts of matters you've just raised to be put before the Privileges Committee and for them to take up with the Ethics Advisor.
No way out, is there? Because no one's going to amend the ICAC Act to shelter this particular information. That's not feasible. Haven't we got a insoluble dilemma? You'd only go to the Ethics Advisor on very mild, trivial matters, nothing serious. Contemplated such matters, but other MPs. I'm just thinking about
You've
utility.
identified a real issue.
Well, I'm thinking about the utility of the ethics advisor, and Mr. Evans is a person of immense integrity. I'm sure his advice has always been useful to MPs, but it was delivered in the context of private confidential sessions, which in one case now is a public exhibit at ICAC.
And the same might be said of private confidential cabinet sessions as well. I mean, the reality is ICAC has the power to access this information, and it's a reality members will have to keep in their mind. And if you're there seeking advice, which, if you like, is in that sort of purview where there are concerns of that nature, then obviously you'd be very guarded. I think that's naturally an issue that you raise that people need to, or former members and members need to take on board in relation to the realities of ICAC's powers.
In terms of our staffing arrangements here, have there been any staff told to stay at home or stood down because they're not fully vaccinated?
No one has been stood down because they're fully vaccinated. And there's no link between the employment at the Parliament and vaccination at this stage. At the moment, we are following the health orders to have, so all of my staff that are attending the building at the moment are fully vaccinated. And I believe that's the case for David as well, although I'll let him speak for himself.
Yes, I can confirm that that's the case for the Department of the Legislative Council as well. However, it is an issue upon which some decisions will be required post 1 December, and we'll be looking with great interest to see exactly what the public health orders say, and we'll also be looking at what advice the Public Service Commission is providing to the public sector for guidance, and but we will have to make some important decisions coming up to 1 December.
Could I just ask you, if we've got the rapid antigen testing, which we all did this morning, and you get your purple band or whatever the colour is, doesn't that deliver a COVID-safe, COVID-free work environment?
It is one of the measures that we have. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Swiss cheese model of safety, that you try and make sure you have layers of safety provision and make sure the holes don't line up. One of our first layers and primary layers is the rapid antigen testing, but vaccination status is another layer. The cleaning we do and cleaning that was done in here, for instance, when we went to our break, is another layer. The social distancing that we've got in various rooms, room density, they're all layers, yes, that contribute to the safety of the.
And at the moment, the roadmap for reopening on the 1st of December is no further proof of vaccination. So
Correct.
Is it the intention of the Parliament to proceed that way for staff?
We, as David said, we have to make some decisions on that regard. So the current roadmap says that from the 1st of December, employers have to make decisions about whether they have vaccinated or unvaccinated people in the building. We haven't made any decisions on that in that regard at all. We're watching what's happening more generally in the community. We're watching to see what if any health orders there might be. We'll make decisions closer to the 1st of December.
And in staff surveys, how many of our staff are affected by this potentially?
We're not collecting formal information. We have asked staff in some instances to indicate voluntarily whether they're vaccinated or not, so we can determine who's in the building. But we've not been storing or collecting that information generally.
But how many of our staff aren't working in the building because of vaccination?
Well, there's actually a lot of our staff aren't working in the building right now, not because of vaccination status, but just because we're keeping people. At the moment, for the Department of Parliamentary Services, those areas where we have we need people in the building, there's been sufficient staff that are fully vaccinated that we've not had to
Answer my question.
issue. Sorry?
To answer my question.
Yeah, so nobody is being excluded in the Department of Parliamentary Services just on the basis of vaccination. At the moment, we're bringing in people that are needed for the operation of the Parliament, and all those people are fully vaccinated.
How many are unvaccinated and not allowed to come in the building at the moment?
I don't have, we're not collecting that information from people. We just, for those people who are asking to come in.
Because you've just said that people are vaccinated.
Yes, that's right, but we're not
in the building. You must be knowing who's on the other side of the
But we're not collecting the information about everybody. So, for instance, when we look at Hansard as an example, we say, okay, how many Hansard people do we need? Are there sufficient Hansard people that are willing to tell us that they're vaccinated in order to meet the demand that we have? And then we're bringing those people in, but the people that don't tell us they might be vaccinated, they might not be, we're not specifically excluding them on that basis.
That's as clear as the frosted door. But can I come back to the team from measurement? How much have we paid them? Are they still on our books?
The original contract was for $20,000. But they weren't able to fill all of that because the COVID situation hit. So I'm not sure how much of that 20,000 we ended up paying.
Are they still on our books?
The intent is to finish the work when people are back in the building under normal capacity. So we would.
What's the name of their company? They're obviously, are they called the team from measurement?
Yeah, it's. I think the company's name is Measurement. I think if I did have that here.
We're in the wrong business, aren't we?
Could be.
You've got another 10 minutes if you want.
Another 10 minutes.
You want me to do a filler for you?
I can ask a few if you want.
I think we've covered things, Madam Chair, to
Sure.
satisfactory level. There's questions there on notice that I'm sure will be.
The clerk had one further answer
Oh, sure.
to
Yeah,
add.
go for it.
Just in answer to a question, I think from Mr Buttigieg that I sort of took on notice a little earlier in relation to sessional staff. So I indicated that one of the conditions of employment for staff classified as sessional, one of the conditions under the award was an additional 2 weeks of leave. The other condition is for staff at grade 9, 10 and above. There's an allowance of $412.20 on sitting days when required to be here after 8 p.m. for officers grade 7, 8 and under grade 7, 8. They're paid overtime by the hour at the relevant overtime rates. Obviously, for a sitting like the 36-hour sitting in November last year, that adds up to a lot more than $412.20. But my calculation of the $412.20 for an average year of 30 sittings past 8 p.m. is about $13,000 a year. So it's about midpoint between the all incidents of employment allowance that member staff have and the all incidents of employment allowance that Hansard staff have.
Yeah, okay. So it gives us some relativity. Yeah, okay.
I did have a couple of answers to things that were taken on notice as well. You asked about, I think Mr. Adam asked about the staffing levels in Hansard. In 2017-18, we had 21 FTE in Hansard. We now have 34.6 FTE in Hansard. So just to give that specifically. My excellent team rolling out the laptops to people have pointed out to me, Mr. Buttigieg, that if demand significantly exceeds what we were anticipating, even taking into account the issues that we talked about, that we may need to go back for more money. They said, don't say we don't need more money, we always need more money. So I thought I'd better put that on the record so that I did not disappoint them down the track. And I think I've covered the rest of those things as we went. Oh, and sorry, the architects that we have in most of our capital works project help us with the review of Australian vendors that might exist that could provide Australian content coming through. And I think that is it.
Can I just squeeze a couple in?
Yeah, so there's 10 minutes. We're still scheduled to go till 12:45, so if there's a couple of questions, I'll open it.
Yep. Just following up on Mr. Latham's line of questioning with the Swiss cheese model and the vaccination, all the rest of it, have the presiding officers turned their mind to the upcoming relevance of the booster shot and the efficacy of the vaccination? Where are we? What's our thinking on that in terms of people needing a booster shot pretty soon, I would have thought?
Well, I can't say that we've sat down and pondered that issue, but indeed we'll certainly be taking advice from HIBS in regard to the next step, obviously the sittings in November, and there has been the issue raised, as you would be aware, in the whips and meeting over the last 3 months, the option of potentially Parliament actually being a vaccination hub. And that's something that has been sort of given some consideration. As for the booster shot, well, I think that's something that we'll see how that evolves. But at this point in time,
well, the reason I raise it, President, is because we've got the November sitting, which we want to be COVID safe and as restriction free as we can.
Yep.
Vaccination rates will play a critical role in that. But if you work on the basis that many MPs would have started being vaccinated around about June, my understanding is the efficacy starts to drop off after, towards the 6-month mark. So it is an issue we need to probably turn our minds to, I think, for November. Yep.
Yeah, there's probably two elements that might be worth mentioning. We are still waiting for the formal advice on this, but most of the commentary seems to be that a booster shot at around the 6-month mark seems to be what's coming in. And as you say, if you talk about when original vaccination became more broadly available in the community, it started in around the June period. So we would expect from December onwards that people would potentially start thinking about boosters. So we're looking at it from that perspective. We're also looking at whether, as you know, we run an annual flu shot process in the Parliament. We're also monitoring the potential for workplaces to have things like booster shots in there as well. It wasn't possible with the original vaccination. It may be possible with the booster program. So we are looking at whether that's a service we can provide within Parliament House, so people can come in and get their booster shot here without having to go everywhere around the place. So yeah, it is something we're looking at taking very seriously.
Okay. Just on the cafe sort of discussion that happened before, I just want to tease it out a bit because there seems to be a little bit of so you got the frosted glass, which was, what was it, 65,000, and there seems to be, I didn't want the view to emanate from that discussion that the 65,000 has put the wood on the whole thing, therefore we may as well go back to tours. I think there's an alternative view, President, with all due respect, that perhaps it's not a bad idea to have glass doors there so people can actually see there's a cafe there. And I'm mindful of the whole economic benefit of the public using the cafe and therefore making it more economically viable for a proper service. I mean, to be frank, sometimes you go down there and you can't get a coffee because, and I'm not blaming the staff, it's just that no one bloody goes there because, there's just not enough demand. Therefore, why have someone sitting there 24/7 waiting to serve coffees? If it was more usable and the public had access and they could see the thing spatially, let's go and have a coffee, and that lifted the use, and then members got a better use out of it. And given the pre-existing costs that we've put into it to get to where we are, my understanding you've dropped some coin on getting it to where it is now. How much is that we've spent on it to get it to the...
About 35,000.
So all that needs to happen, my understanding is that you drop a couple of glass doors in there and it's done. Is that right? if we were to go down
You've got
that
to pay
path.
for the glass doors and,
Yeah, sure.
and the works, etc. But look, as I said, there are a range of considerations here, and public signage on the existing doors into that area is another option, which at the moment doesn't really exist. And we're looking at the range of options. The impact on the exhibition space is pretty severe, and the proposal, as mooted, is to bring tables and chairs into the actual fountain court area, which is against the heritage
You
values.
wouldn't necessarily have to do that, would you, President? You could theoretically just put the glass doors in, keep that space, and just have the visibility there. And that. So what I'm getting at is, do you need to do a cost-benefit analysis on? Okay, it's going to cost us. What was the amount, Mark, to put the glass doors in?
The original higher tech doors.
No, just the cost to put just vanilla glass doors in now.
So that would be about another 18 or 19,000.
18 or 19,000, and keeping in mind the cost that we've taken to get us to this point, and what's the economic benefit of that versus let's just can the whole thing together and write the pre-existing expenditure off. Wouldn't it be logical to go through that cost-benefit analysis and make an assessment of how much patronage we're likely to get as a result of that increased visibility?
Well, I suppose you could make assumptions about that until the cows come home.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, there are other issues, I think, that are live there as well. And the exhibition space.
Yeah. What's the alternative? Where does the exhibition space go?
Well, you lose quite significant exhibition
Where does it go?
space.
What's the alternative?
You lose it.
You lose it.
You lose it.
Because it's a great space. It hosts functions there, and
it is.
outside groups come in and meet MPs.
And I think we can manage the exposure issue in terms of proper signage, which could be very clearly positioned not only where you walk into the area that sort of is adjacent to the Macquarie room and the entrance, if you like, to the staff bar, the public cafe, but also further back in the actual the fountain court towards where you come in, so people know there's a public cafe at the moment.
Sorry, I may have misinterpreted. So what you're saying is it's an either-or proposition. We can't have our cake and eat it too. In other words, retain the exhibition space but open the visibility to the pre-existing cafe space.
That's right. You lose all that exhibition space, and when you go through that, just walk along there and just position yourself as you walk through. You've got the continuity of the exhibition, then suddenly you hit doors and people moving in and out, and then you sort of lose those areas on both sides of the doors as well. And it is a very high demand exhibition space. We have at least 12 major exhibitions a year, and it's something that in the concept plans for the fountain court was seen as one of the very most important exhibition spaces in New South Wales, and we're very keen to ensure that's not compromised. And the proposal that was seen at the time to move towards chairs and tables would further compromise that against the heritage plans that have been in place so far as clutter in that fountain court, which architecturally is quite magnificent and improved by not going down that pathway.
President, I'm open-minded about it. I just wonder how much this has been socialised with members, because to be frank with you, only sort of brought to my attention this morning. So, and that may be my fault because I wasn't paying attention, but I'm not sure many members understand what the propositions are. But I'll move on just quickly, Chair. Library staff, can you give us a snapshot of how many FTEs are vacant in the library, if any? And how many, while we're on it, just for brevity, how many positions within the Parliamentary Library have been abolished or restructured?
We are looking at the library structure at the moment, so there's been a review going on for the last while. That included some consultation with members about what services were required, and there is a shifting of resources into the areas that have higher demand, like the research side of things, for instance. No one is losing their job as a part of that process. It's more about changing the roles people have in the library. That's been the subject of extensive consultation and lots of work by the excellent library leadership team over the last little while. I'm happy to take on notice the number of vacancies. I'm not aware of any against the funded positions that we have. I know in the past there have been some discussions about positions that used to exist in the library and whether they should be reinstated, which is a matter of some of the funding discussions that we've had in the past. But in terms of the positions that are funded at the moment, I'm not aware of any substantive vacancies. I'm sure there is always people resign and we recruit to fill the position, of course.
Okay.
But I'm not aware of any sustained ones.
All right, if you could get us those on notice, funded FTEs versus vacancies, that'd be handy.
And we're at time now, so I'll invite the government if you wish to.
I'm delighted to advise we won't be having any questions.
Thank you very much.
We are very comfortable and happy with the management of the Parliament.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, and to the other officials for attending today. We appreciate it. The Secretariat will be in touch in relation to, I know you've provided some answers at the end here, but any other questions that were taken on notice in terms of the timetable for response. But thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Ask the committee to stay for 1 second, but